We're not out there fighting anything other than crime.
We see stuff that nobody should have to
Put
see.
your hands back! Hands back! Hands back! Go!
Get out of it, Mel. Get out of it! Get out of it!
Don't move! Don't move!
Okay. George 31, erect out.
Don't go! Don't go! Don't go!
Put it in paper.
You're going to jail. Where else do you think you're going?
You're listening to The Beat, Profiles of Police Nationwide. And after a couple of fire-related shows, we get back to the police side of things with this volume 25, the quarter-century volume of The Beat, Profiles of Police Nationwide. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to what is episode 419 of the Mike to New Haven podcast, besides it being volume 25 of The Beat, Profiles of Police Nationwide. Last couple weeks brought some FDNY shows for the best of the bravest, which was both fun and nice to do as always. We had, of course, my friend Kevin Kubler, of whom I work with on the Getting Salty experience, and of course, Ken Delaney also joined us too for another volume of the best of the bravest interviews with the FDNY's elite, respectively, volumes 87 and 88. Been a busy time for yours truly, a lot of work behind the scenes, both related to the show and unrelated, just working period. Of course, it's a happy time for me as a big New York Knicks fan. The New York Knicks, for the first time since 1999, before I was born, are in the NBA Finals, where they'll be playing either the San Antonio Spurs, who ironically they played back in 99, the last time they made it, or the Oklahoma City Thunder. So the city's going to be electric. It already is. But let's see if the Knicks, for the first time since 1973, can win an NBA championship. And as someone, just a brief note on that has seen the Yankees win a World Series and the Giants win 2 Super Bowls, the one thing or two things I have not seen is a Rangers Stanley Cup that happened in 1994. I was born in 2000, so 6 years before my time, and a New York Knicks championship. So because of the fact that the Knicks have sucked for the majority of this century up until 6 years ago, that championship would mean way more to me, just because at least with the Rangers, I've seen some good Ranger teams. I saw them get to a final and just didn't win it. So I'd be remiss if I didn't point out my Knicks, but I don't want to keep my guest waiting too long. He's in the back there, and he's a Rhode Island guy, so he's probably a Boston sports fan. Don't mean to rub it in, of course, but you have enough championships. Let me have my moment. So I'll run an ad, and then, of course, we'll introduce him. And the first one is going to be from our friend Vince over at Armor Tuff. When it comes to firehouses, the floors take a beating. Boots, waters, tools, apparatus traffic, it just never stops. That's why departments like the Gloucester City, New Jersey Fire Department and so many others trust Armor Tuff Flooring and Tile. From the hallways to the training rooms to the apparatus bays, Armor Tuff delivers a clean, professional finish built to handle the daily grind of the job. Durable, seamless, and designed specifically for high-demand public safety environments, this isn't just flooring, it's infrastructure you can count on. And it doesn't stop at the floor. Take a look at the Grove's gear racks, built with integrated security features to protect turnout gear, personal equipment, and department assets. Secure storage, smart design, and built to last, because your gear deserves the same protection you provide to your community. If your department is ready to upgrade its space from the bay floor to the gear room, reach out to Armor Tuff Flooring and Tile, built for the fire service, built to last. And you'll hear from Brett King before we get to the rapid fire. Anybody that wants to sponsor the show, whether it be fire service side, police side, whatever you got, hit me up on Facebook. Hit me up anywhere. I'm more than happy to advertise on the program, and that can definitely be negotiated. Darren Phillips tuning in, Christian Williams, John Costello. Darren is a diehard Vancouver Canucks fan. He says, I've seen a Rangers Stanley Cup, unfortunately. It was the Canucks they beat in 1994. That's why he said that. And hello to my buddy Andrew Wood, who I was just talking with on the phone. He's tuning in tonight from his volunteer house in Shelton. Good man, New Haven fireman. All right, my next guest is a U.S. Marine veteran, retired Providence Police Lieutenant, senior executive in emergency management, and nationally recognized leadership instructor. Over a career that spanned the Corps, the streets of a capital city, and crisis command at the federal level, he's led teams where failure simply was not an option. And today he's helping shape the next generation of police leaders through his AIO leadership framework, adapt, improvise, and overcome. And that for this volume 25 of The Beat, Profiles of Police Nationwide, is retired Providence Police Lieutenant Sean Carroll. Sean, welcome. How are you?
Thank you, Mike. It's a pleasure to be here, and congratulations on the Knicks. And you're right, we've definitely had our run up here in New England. Being a football coach for many years in Rhode Island, it was great to have Tom Brady up the street to just say, do like he does.
No, essentially, yeah. And I, even as a Giants fan, I argue the point all the time. He's the greatest of all time for me. The only acceptable alternative answer is Joe Montana. Otherwise, I'll argue that Tom Brady is the greatest to ever do it. He always had my respect.
And we definitely have something in common. I'm a diehard Giants fan, born and raised. And it was funny because the only time that it ever became a challenge for me was when the Giants were playing the Patriots in the Super Bowl. And so I have a picture. I wound up doing a security detail for the Giants years later, and I met David Tyree.
Nice.
So he and I took a picture. So every year when all of my buddies, the Patriots fans, go on, social media and post the helmet catch that ruined the perfect season, I am happy to post my picture with David Tyree, and it's one of the few times that I actually will extol the virtues of the New York Giants. Not so much at the end of the game after, everybody had a couple of pops. So I was like, let me save this celebration for later. And I kind of skirted out of that one. But it was a great night all the same.
I often make the joke. I said, listen, and I've always respected the Patriots, but I can never hate Tom Brady. He gave me two of my happiest moments as a Giants fan. So of course I can't hate him. So good to know we share that in common, my friend. So before we get into anything involving your career, and it's interesting because you do have a family legacy of law enforcement, which we'll talk about. Just tell me about growing up in the area and being exposed to the profession early on, which started all the way back in the early 20th century with your great-grandfather.
Yeah, and the great part about that was I didn't even discover that until almost at the end of my career. It was kind of a weird story, but I wound up meeting one of the archivists for the city of Providence, and just through some random interactions, I discovered that my great-grandfather had been on a job, and they actually found there was only one or two documents that were in his personnel folder that were like microfiche, or I don't know where they were, but it was just wild to see his name. And then after that, I think he was like 1902, 1903. And then my uncle, who has an amazing story unto himself, became a sergeant. He got on in 1955. And then my father got on in 74, and I wound up getting on in 99, obviously right before you were born. And it was a very unique experience. And because as full disclosure, I was born to a single teen mom, and she wound up meeting my dad when I was maybe 8 or 9 years old. And I say my dad because he was my father. I never knew my biological dad, and he was, to me, was like a superhero, and he still is. God rest his soul. And I remember, growing up in a cop's house. We were one side of the family was Portuguese, the other side is Irish. Both sides were blue collar and very old school. So that was a very Gen X, I guess you could call it, upbringing in a house like that. But hearing all the war stories, learning from somebody like my father was, and I'm not just saying this because he's my father, but he was a legend. He had, I can't remember how many Supreme Court decisions that he and his partner, Steve Springer, were involved with. At one point in 1 year, I think they handled more murder cases on themselves in the city of Providence than the entire state had. So they were just very well known, epic guys. And it was a really, really amazing thing for me because as a kid, one of the first memories I ever had of him. Now, I just met him, and he took me under his wing. And it was just an amazing experience for me to finally have a dad. But not only is he dad, he's a cool dad. He's a super cop. And so I remember one of my first memories is we're out at a party or we're at a gathering or something, birthday, I forget what it was. And I remember I think a beeper went off, and my dad said, we gotta go. And I remember going home with my mom, and he had to go to work. And then she turned the news on, and on the news is this, there had been a bank robbery in South Providence, which is where he worked. And what happened was the bank robbers, as they're getting away, they wrecked their car. They wind up having a bailout. And really long story, really short, one of the three robbers hides inside a house, and he winds up surprising one of the patrol officers, and he takes him hostage with his own gun. Mm-hmm. And what made it dramatic was, I don't know how, but somehow a local news reporter happened to be there as this was unfolding or nearby, and winds up recording the entire event. And so it's actually still a YouTube video that you can find. It's from 1984, February of 1984, and it shows the bad guy is coming out, and he's got the police officer up against him, and they're facing each other, and he's looking out into the street. It's in a residential neighborhood, and there are all the cruisers there, and he's walking out, and he notices that there's a detective's car, and it has the door open, and so he decides this is going to be his getaway. So now he's trying to maneuver, how do I get this police officer in the passenger seat but get himself in and not expose himself too much. And there were a lot of parts about that story that stuck out to me, but the one that really got me the most was as they were going to get away, the bad guy is telling all the cops there that he's basically going to kill this guy, the police officer that he has held hostage. And one of my father's squad mates sneaks up on him from the passenger side, and he winds up shooting him and taking him down. But then there was just a hail of bullets as this unfolds. And I'll never forget, my father had a very distinctive red LL Bean winter coat. And all of a sudden I see it fly in from the side, and he rips the door open, and they're ripping the police officer out, making sure that the bad guy, is neutralized. And I mean, that was just an amazing, not only was it incredible to watch just as a video, but then to say, hey, that's my dad. That's cool stuff, And then getting older, I had a cousin who was a legend, Sergeant Edmund Malloy. He was a little younger, and he was awesome because he was more my speed. Plus, my father was doing detective work. It's not the same as being out on the street. So my cousin worked in a super high crime area where I wound up working, which is where my father was a detective years later. So as I got older, he would let me do ride-alongs. Let me tell you, that was pure adrenaline. I mean, you want to talk about like cops from the front row. It was the greatest show on earth, and it was amazing. And this is the mid '80s, so this is the crack epidemic is going wild, and it was some really weird. So I was hooked between my father and my cousin. I was absolutely hooked. And then as I moved on, and got closer to being on the job, I got married. I had a daughter at that time, and getting on, one of the coolest moments for me really was not only earning my way into the South Side, because the way it worked at that time was kind of like the game show Survivor. And what I mean by that is, as much as you could bid into a district, only way you were, and you're laughing, right? Because I'm sure the New York guys do the same thing. You can bid all you want, but if they don't want you there, you're not going. And the way that they did it was, if even one person said no, and they didn't even ask why, if one person says no. So I was very, very fortunate to get kind of thrown in the deep end, if you will. And I was, through some happenstance, I was put into the South Side, which at that time, that was the place. That was where all the best cops were, for the most part. That was where all the action was. And, there was a little cachet to it. Like you were, you would kind of, that was where the guys who went to do police work went. And it was a great, great experience. But I'll never forget, there was a tragic murder of a young girl, and I'll never forget standing there at the scene, and it was me and my father at the same time. And then there were a couple of other moments through some high-profile cases where, I worked the overnight shift, and he'd be coming in, and he'd be calling me on the phone as I'm driving home saying, hey, what happened last night? Or we're looking for so-and-so, or what's this one driving? And it was just really, really wild to be able to work with your dad in a cool way. And, and obviously he wound up, when I got promoted to detective, he pinned me with his badge. And that was just a very surreal moment. So I was very fortunate to have an amazing upbringing, an amazing career, and an amazing family that made the groundwork for me before I got here.
Right. And that groundwork also was laid in the Marine Corps before you even got to the Providence Police Department. Because, and again, I say it to guys all the time, and the longtime listeners of this program have heard me say it. It's not to minimize the training that goes on in a fire academy, if that's the route you're going, or the police academy, if that's the route you're going. But after going through any sort of militaristic training in any of the branches, especially the Marine Corps, anything else after that compared to that level of intense training is a cakewalk. So the Corps, of course, also prepared you pretty freaking well.
It really, really did. It was, from a discipline standpoint, there's no comparison to Parris Island, being, that's kind of a one of a kind experience. So being in the police academy, it was more annoying, than anything else. Ironically, our head instructor, who was a sergeant, was also a Marine. So he brought some special sauce to the academy that that some of the other people didn't see coming. That it was fortunate because I was class president for most of the time. So I was like, hey guys, don't worry about it. I know what we're doing here. Just stick with me. So it worked out really well. But it was a great experience, and that was still at that time we were still going through what I would call more of a boot camp academy than what I've seen lately, across the country. Not necessarily a gentleman's academy per se, but certainly a lot more academic and a lot less physical. There were so many different aspects of that academy. Like, we pretty much built up an immunity to pepper spray by the time we were done, and some other things. I think I have a 1/4 inch on my triceps from a couple of the people that didn't do the right thing all the time. Of always having to get down and push, but it was a great time, and again, having those experiences before me, I had an idea of what was coming, and it really prepared me for a lot of the rigors. The thing that tricked me though, Mike, honestly, was there were two things that it didn't prepare me for that I thought I was prepared for. The first one was getting on, and again, hearing all these stories from my family that were in very unique situations on the job, and there were certain people that I found pretty quickly that weren't as happy to receive me, and not just me, but anybody. And I'm sure you've heard those stories too. And it was really weird for me because the differences in the Marines, there were guys that I hated in the Marines, but I'd still take a bullet for them, and vice versa. And then you get here, and there were people that were jealous. There were people that were insecure. There were people that were bullies. There were, and it's all very stereotypical stuff, and it's not unique to police work. But I didn't expect that, and I wasn't necessarily prepared for that. So that was a little bit of an adjustment for me. But once I, figured it out and got through it, that was easy enough. And the other part was just about, dealing with trauma and thinking I had it all figured out. And, we can talk about that later, but that was a whole nother situation that came up later in my career. So in some ways it really prepared me, and in a couple, and that's probably my fault that I thought I was prepared when I wasn't. I wasn't as rock hard as I thought I was in certain situations, but it made me harder in the end.
Oh, of course, and as time progresses, I often make the joke it builds character. But in all seriousness, it really does, because a lot of the situations you're encountering are situations that a lot of people go through that aren't in these types of professions, go through a lifetime of never having to deal with, nor do you want them to, right? But these are things that someone's most traumatic moment in the first responder field in any sort of emergency response capacity is just Tuesday. And I don't mean to be funny when I say that. I'm not trying to be, but to your point, these events, not that you're dealing with a traumatic incident every single day to the level of that it's horrid, but these events, they stockpile up, and after a while they begin to blend together because you're always on the go, especially where you work. You were very busy.
Absolutely. I remember the first few weeks that I was, am I still here? You got me?
Yeah. There was just a bit of a delay. Go ahead.
When I first got into my post in the South Side, I want to say there was 10 or 11 shootings in my first set of tours. And that was like in a week, and that was on my post, not in our district, because there hadn't been anybody on my post. And as any good street cop knows, I mean, the people that were on the corners, they literally could look at you and tell you within a couple of months how long you've been on the job. It was wild how they knew. And there hadn't been anybody there for almost a year that was bidded. So no one had really leaned into that post. It was everybody just being sent there. So it took me months to just figure it out. And you want to talk about getting dropped in the deep end of the pool. This was a super high crime area at that particular time, and very wild. I mean, we were shots fired, car chases, all kinds of wild incidents. It was an average thing. Like, that was on a Thursday, Friday, Saturday night. I used to love when we would have a Monday holiday and it was a Thursday through Sunday, because then you knew you were going to get action every night. Not so much at the end of my career when I was a supervisor, but certainly at the beginning, like what we considered fun back then. I don't know that, or as we used to say, we put the FU in fun, but it was good stuff. And I'll tell you what, if nothing else, I was very, very fortunate to be with some of the guys that trained me, especially Mike Snelly, God rest his soul. was just amazing. These guys are amazing street cops, and there were so many of them, and I was very, very fortunate. And it became more obvious what a big deal that was later when I became a supervisor, because I took for granted at that time that everyone that I was working with had, I think the average was about 10 years, 10 to 15 years on the job. All the people that I was working with, some were out of the last academy ahead of me, but there were some that had 20 to 30 years on, still working the overnight shift, still doing police work. And I, fast forward to a few years later when I become a sergeant and I'm on the same shift, and I'll never forget doing roll call, and I'm looking up at these kids, and I say kids because they were, and the senior person had 2 years,
Wow.
where in my time it was 25 to 30. I mean, as my father used to say, they can't find their ass in a phone booth with both hands. Like they haven't even figured out, they don't even know what they don't know yet. So it was, as a supervisor, that was a challenge for me that I hadn't really seen coming, because I remembered what it was like for me. We didn't call a sergeant, there would be somebody would roll up that would have 15, 20 years. I mean, 2 or 3 of the guys that were mentors to me were in the same academy as our sergeant. So they weren't calling the sergeant to ask questions. They were simply calling him to tell him what had happened or what he needed to know in case anybody asked. So there were a lot of things that I learned to appreciate much more later on in my career, and that was certainly one of them.
Absolutely. And that's a lost art now in law enforcement. It's not to say that these guys that have 2 or 3 years aren't squared away, aren't doing their best. They are, and that's no knock on them. And I don't want it to be interpreted as such. It's just
Sure.
knowledge is rooted in time and seeing things go down. Trial and error, too. I had this. It happened to me once, for example, in the field. And as a result of this, I learned X, Y, and Z, and they're able to pass that lesson down to the next generation. Even just finding somebody with 10 years or close to it now, it's close because I feel like across the board, and it's not just an emergency response thing. I think it's a lot of professions. They're getting younger, and there's pros to that. But one of the cons is the street factor, or just the life experience factor. There's not enough of it to go around, and it's a harder learning curve these days for anybody getting on the job.
For sure, especially when you work a beat, people know you. And I'll never forget certain calls, when I was really, really new and still figuring everything out, and I'd be in the middle of something and somebody'd be giving me a bunch of flack, and then one of the senior guys would show up and they'd be like, oh, all right. And all of a sudden it was like, now everybody's sitting hands on knees and, yes sir, no sir. And that was wild to watch, but it was something you had to earn, and I'll never forget being, there was one guy, his nickname was Boogie Brown. And I forget, everyone knew him as Boogie. He was like one of the top shelf bad guys, public enemy #1. And I'll never forget one night, I got to know him. He lived my post. We had a lot of wild stories, he and I. And one night I stumbled across this big heroin deal. It was a couple kilos, which was kind of rare. I mean, to happen on the street. It was the middle of the night, it was like 4 a.m. And I was out there just tagging cars, just kind of, learning the streets and knowing where everything is. And as I kind of get involved in this, it turned into a big melee, and I wound up in a pretty wild fight with these 2 guys. And I wound up seeing the guy Boogie Brown later, and he said, yeah, how about thank you? I had no idea what he was talking about. I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, what you didn't see was there was a bunch of kids down the alley that were coming out to meet with them, and they were going to come jump you. And basically I told them to stop. And I said, okay, wow, all right, thank you. And I said, not to push it, but why did you do that? And he referenced the time that there was another officer there that didn't work that area. And, he felt was being too aggressive and mistreating him. And I kind of toned it down. And I was a much younger, less senior officer, and he recognized that dynamic. And, as weird as it sounds, that's a huge compliment to get from someone, that is just a true bad guy. He was not worried about getting arrested. He wasn't worried about that at all. And, it's funny how I'm sure other guys, and you've had some legends on this show before me, I'm sure they have similar stories when it's kind of like, that's when you made it, when the bad guys respect you.
Right. And that's the thing. I feel like, and this is not to give criminals credit, they're criminals, especially career criminals. But, career criminals of a certain era, I'll say, there was, because that was pretty much their full-time job, there was, I guess, a bit of a respect factor for police from the standpoint that, hey, more so, I guess the attitude was, it's the cost of doing business. I got my job to do, even though it's not a good one. They got their job to do, so if our paths cross, I mean, as long as they respect me, if I got to go down, I got to go down. So at least there was that dynamic, and it sounds like he was one of those bad guys where at least, okay, if you know what you're getting into and you understand the full depth of the choices you're making, after a while, and cops understand it too, work in the street, and certainly you did, you understand how to play the game, because it's all interpersonal, it's all to a certain degree in how you deal with people, transactional too.
Right, of course. And that was what I learned from my father and his partner, was how to talk to people, because as much as these were, old white guys that were cops, I mean, every one of those things was not well received in the neighborhood we worked, but everywhere that they went, they would call my father's name, they'd call Springer's name. If something happened, they were the only two that they would speak to. And they had built that through years of being honest with people, being fair. And I learned from those guys. I learned that it's just as much a skill to be able to talk to the janitor as it is the CEO. So you can leave the chief's office and go and deal with some homeless guy out on the street that has an addiction problem. And being able to navigate all those different levels in between socially was absolutely not only a very important skill. I mean, quite frankly, that's really what made you a better cop, was the way you could talk to people, the way you could get information, the way you get people to trust you, was really something really unique. And that's another lost art. I think in this day and age, everything's technology and, texts and all these other things. But at the end of the day, especially being a detective, when you get somebody in the box and you're sitting across the table from them, there's no app that's going to do that for you. There's no AI. It's you and another human being that's sitting there, and you have to basically sit across from someone, tell them that, I'm trying to put you in jail. And then you warn them that everything you say I'm going to use against you. And now the challenge becomes, how are you going to get that person to confess to you? And I was very fortunate to have acquired that skill, but it was absolutely learned from years of watching and learning from people like my father and all the great cops that trained me before I got there.
There's a great show that highlighted it about as realistically as one could. And there's not many police shows over the years that have been made that are realistic. But this one, it ended right as you came on the job in 1999. I don't know if you remember it, Homicide: Life on the Street, which was loosely based off the Baltimore Police Department Homicide Squad. It was a book David Simon wrote, where he spent a year with them, which was then turned into a television show. And it ran for seven fantastic seasons, I should say. And there was that dynamic constantly. And there was even an episode they dedicated to it where they explained it, and the clip's on YouTube in case you guys want to watch it, called The Box, just that, where they explain, really, you shouldn't be talking to us. If you know what's good for you, you probably shouldn't say anything. But again, it's the dynamic. It's the trust dynamic. You're in a dicey situation as someone that may have witnessed the crime or may be involved in the crime. Why should I trust you? Any good cop, after a while, learns to break that dynamic and learns, like we said earlier, to play the game. And it's great to watch those masters at work, because you just say to yourself, given, especially with how you explained it, how do they do it? Especially under those circumstances.
Right. It was wild stuff. And I think that's something that, when we talked earlier about the, all the institutional knowledge leaving departments, I was kind of at the tail end of that wave, I guess, when I retired in 2022. But it's devastating. We were at a huge department. My department is over 400 officers, another 100 and change civilian support. We were very big, capital city, the police department. So we're not like some of these smaller agencies and, that are 20, 25, 30 guys. So you lose 3 or 4 people that are in the patrol bureau, at a 25-man to a 30-man department. That's a huge hit. And that's like a shift, and like I've said to many chiefs, as I, go talking to people around the country still with my consulting now, is, I say to them, what do you do? How do you replace that? Do you know how long it takes to replace a 30-year veteran? 30 years, right? So you can't just hire, 6 5-year veterans don't make up a 30-year officer, because the things they know, the things that they've been through is something that you can't just read in a book, and learning it the same way they've done through since the dawn of time, of telling stories and explaining how we got here, and this is what created the situation, and this is how that happened. having that historical knowledge of the agency and of the people there is really, really important. And that's why I'm trying to pay it forward, and hopefully we can keep that going.
It's going to segue perfectly into talking about the housing bureau that you had for a little bit and where it's involved in, because that's another interesting dynamic. But I didn't want to pass it by without highlighting this from Eric Fries, who's a retired New York City police detective, worked most of his career in Brooklyn. And he says, and he would know because he policed during that era as well, I used to have appointment arrest. Guys would come in when asked. Some cops, detectives never learned this. And Eric, of course, is an alumni of this show. And again, it's true. Like, that's a lost art.
It is. And I think it's because people don't invest the amount of time that it takes for you to get that type of a reputation in the community, for people to know, oh, all right, it's cool. I was, I have a lot of tattoos. So at one point when I was in detectives, there was a big problem at the time with Asian gangs. And, funny enough, a lot of people think that I look Asian. Some of the people in the gangs did. And I don't know how it started, but one of them told the story that I was like some hitman from LA and I was hiding out here and somehow I didn't get arrested and I had gotten behind enemy lines and I was a cop. I don't know where this crazy story came from. But anyway, wherever it came from, it was enough that people would talk to me. And, obviously, as most people know, gangs aren't real into talking to police. So the way that you earn that, and you have to earn it, is you have to earn it by being fair. You have to earn it by being honest. You have to earn it by being sometimes compassionate to people that most wouldn't think deserve it. And I think that's where you earn it. That's how you get someone that knows they're going to come in. And I've done it too. And looking back tactically, maybe it wasn't always perfect. But to say to somebody, hey, listen, I'm not going to cuff you in front of your kids. Like, let's just go outside and we'll do it like gentlemen. 99% of the time, they would respect that and understand that and appreciate it. I mean, I don't know how many people that I would see out in public and they immediately recognized me as their arresting officer and they would buy me a drink or just come up and thank me or say, sorry, I fought with you or whatever. And, and that's because you're being fair, you're treating people with respect. But you're also handling your business and making sure that everybody goes home safe.
Right. And that just to get back to your career now, it segues perfectly into housing, because I've said this before when talking to guys in New York City back when the housing police was separate from the NYPD. That is, I think, besides maybe transit, the most unique beat an officer can have, because you're really talk about really being embedded in the community. If they didn't know you before, they're going to get to know you, and quicker than just walking down the street. You go through these projects. Most of the time, the projects get a bad rap, but we've covered it before on the show, and you know this, and you can speak to it. 90% of the people living in those projects are good people. They're working hard. They're raising their families. They're trying to go to school. They're trying to go to work. But you got that 10%. And that's the 10% you're always dealing with, because the recidivism within such a compact community is going to be higher than most. And that, you talk about interpersonal, not only getting to know the good people, getting to know the bad people, both sides of the coin, you get to know them very, very intimately, very, very quickly.
Yeah. And when, working in the housing unit was, again, as I say it out loud, I was super fortunate that all of the guys there were amazing cops, had worked in that unit for a long time, and I got plugged into a crew that, they knew everybody. They knew generations. There was nothing they didn't know. And the moment that something happened, it would be like, all right, Kenny's going to be over at B205. Let's go grab, or, the aunt would call and say, hey, we don't want a big thing. Like, we'll get him down to the office. Like, but please don't come blasting through the door at 4 a.m, and all that stuff. So again, that was the relationship you had. Our office was in the housing unit. We were actually in the first level of a high rise, and we were always around. We were always there, and you got to learn really quickly that if they didn't like you or they didn't trust you, it was different than when you were a beat officer, because you go to a house, you respond to a call, you drive away, you may not go back there for weeks, months, years. Whereas this, you're there all the time. And one of the really great moments that meant a lot to me for a lot of reasons was actually later, after I had gotten out of the housing unit and I got promoted to sergeant after being a detective. And there was one in particular, and I remember bringing some of the officers in to meet some of the tenants that lived in this particular housing high rise was for older folks. And at first the officers were a little resistant. Obviously their boss is telling them what we're going to do, so they're going along with it, but I could tell they were kind of feeling weird. And for the most part, I think we were 3/4 of the police officers at that particular time were white in a very black community. There had been some tension between the residents of the city and the police department for various reasons. I mean, in any capital city, that's how it goes. I'll never forget bringing those officers in, and I think they were not really sure what they were going to encounter. And all these residents, it took a little bit, because again, I had developed that relationship with them while I was in the housing unit, and they remembered me. So when I came back, now I'm a supervisor, and I said, look, I'd like you to meet some of my team. And I brought them in, and what was really amazing was not so much the reaction from the folks, it was watching the officers. And to be plain, they came in kind of guarded and just standing there up against the wall, like didn't really know what to think. And I remember as we kind of broke out and started talking to people and had a little food, little drink, and there was one particular lady, and it just so happened that she picked the one officer that was really not feeling this event. And she looked up at him and she said, I won't forget that she said, "Thank you." And you could tell like it took his guard down, and she explained why. And she said, my friend lives across the street, and we play pinochle or whatever card game we used to do a couple times a week. And because of these gang kids hanging on the corner, I don't feel safe going to get my prescriptions. And I basically became a prisoner in my own home. But now that you are all here and you're helping get rid of that element and making things safe for us, I can get back to living my life. And that was a wild moment, and I've always carried that with me, in not only for what it was worth as a moment, for a lot of reasons, but also I've taken that as a leader into various teams, and the purpose was, what are we doing this for, right? That's why you're doing it. As much as, listen, at the end of the day, anyone that is a good street cop would be lying if they told you that they didn't do it for the adrenaline rush, because we're all adrenaline junkies. We're clearly missing a screw, because why would we be running toward stuff that everybody's running away from, right? Right. But at the end of the day, that's what it's about. What are we doing here? You want to feel good about what you're doing, because that's cool to have some excitement and a little foot chase or whatever, to get the adrenaline flowing. But to know that there are people that are telling you they sleep better at night because of you, that's hard to replace. And it really changed the dynamic, especially in that neighborhood with that team, and totally changed it. And you could see it, because instead of people just going and taking a call, you could tell by the way they were talking to people that they were really actively following up, that they would, if there was a problem, they'd just sit on that problem and find a way to make it go away. And they just cared a lot more. And I loved that. And it's not that other cops don't, it's because they just never make that connection. And that's what we were able to do. It was really, really great, and a powerful thing that I hope they carry forward.
Right. And the other aspect of it too is it really diminishes the cynicism, because as you know, in this line of work, it's very easy to get jaded after a while when you're dealing with a lot of the same people and seeing a lot of bad stuff go down, both in the moment and responding after the fact, that it's kind of a factory reset. Oh, yeah, this is why I'm doing the job. This is who I'm doing it for. Even if they don't outright explicitly tell it to you, they're observing, they're watching, they do appreciate it, even if they don't always have the chance to tell you. And that was probably the first time she had the chance to tell him. And I'm sure, if he wasn't feeling the event then, it changed his perspective, and he was, certainly feeling it now.
Sure. Yeah, that was a powerful moment. And I think that was what made it even more powerful for him, was because, to be plain, as a white cop in a black neighborhood, he wasn't getting a lot of warm reception, which was natural. We expected that. I mean, that was just the way it was. We didn't come to work with a chip on our shoulder, but we certainly didn't feel like we were waiting for a thank you from anybody. And I think not only for them to get it, but to get it from someone that they really didn't expect it from. And then even on top of that, to have that person be vulnerable enough to say to that officer, like, I sleep better because of you. It's a powerful thing. It's a really powerful thing. And I think it reconnected, at least for him, it connected him back to at the beginning, because that's what I used to say to when I would have officers that were either being toxic or in that same realm, when I would encounter them and say, like, obviously you didn't get out of a job like this, right? You didn't come in day one and say, oh my God, this sucks and this is awful. It happens to you over time. So as much as that's understandable, to your point, right? Like, and I used to joke with people all the time, why don't you dispatch me to a birthday? I've never been sent to a bar mitzvah. No one's ever called me and said, hey, just wanted you to come by and say congratulations that you guys got married or had a graduation or a new baby, right? They only called you when something bad happened. And I remember reading a book years ago called What Cops Know. And in one of the stories out of Chicago was this old school like captain or something that had been on like 40 years. And he had the great quote. He says, even as a cop, when I'm driving down the street and I see a police car sitting on the side of the road, and as I drive by, like they pull out, I think, oh, what does this jerk want? So those are the things that I remember thinking, like, I want to change that, when I get the opportunity to be a supervisor, or bring people back to what they knew so that they don't come to work, miserable, because 8 hours feels like it lasts 18 when everything stinks.
Right. And there's days like that, but it's important to not make every day like that, to better prevent, of course, getting jaded. I think the key too, and it segues perfectly back into your career, of not getting jaded, is moving around if you can. I'm sure you appreciated the housing assignment. You loved patrol, obviously. I don't know what you felt on traffic. I feel that's what you make of it, because a lot of people feel, oh, you're just pulling over soccer moms. Some cops are doing that, and it's a laziness factor. But other cops are looking out, okay, does this guy have warrants? If I run his plate right now, maybe he's coming back to something. And if you're really a go-getter, traffic is what you make of it. But the motorcycle unit and the rifle team, and we'll start with the motorcycle unit, because I haven't had the chance to really talk with a lot of guys who've done that. It's, again, another unique beat where talk about it just being you. A lot of guys will work a one-man car in certain departments, or a two-man car for the most part, but some guys work a one-man car, especially if you're a supervisor. Maybe you don't always have a driver. But the motorcycle unit presents a very interesting dynamic where you're almost like a rover. It's not only the roads, but you can just as easily assist on a man with a gun call. You can just as easily assist on a narcotics complaint. That's another it's what you make of it assignment. And I'll ask you, what type of training goes into, if you weren't certified already, being able to join a unit like that?
The traffic unit was a very elite unit for many, many years. And it was, you kind of had to be selected, not quite as much by the time I got there, obviously. But what the reason why I'm laughing is because Kenny Colón, who was my lieutenant of my academy, was a huge traffic guy, great, very, very super smart reconstructionist, just a great guy, great cop. And I remember, kind of ribbing him about like, traffic, that's for giving out tickets and stuff. Why don't you just join the state police? And I used to rail on traffic all the time. The only reason that we appreciated traffic in the patrol bureau was because they took accidents. And the reason why that was important, because accidents were super time consuming, took forever. Never mind working overnights, there was always impairment. And I mean, that could sideline you for the rest of the night. Right. So that was the biggest concern. So when the traffic guy pulled up, it was like, oh my God, thank God. Years later, not that long after, a new chief came in, and at the time, the policy was only traffic ticket accidents. For a patrol officer to take an accident, it had to be something really extreme, or the traffic guys there was too much going on. It's snowing, it's accidents all over the place, and everybody kind of knew that. But it was very unique. So I can say this now: the only real reason at the time that I went to traffic was for the motorcycles, because you were allowed to ride the Harleys, right? So I've been riding bikes since I was a kid, and it wasn't like the guys that are in it now are like chips, right? They're like, because we didn't even have a legitimate motorcycle unit at the time. Everyone rode bikes, but it wasn't like this. Now there's a professional motorcycle team. They do training, and they're awesome, way better than I ever was. But working on the overnight, being able to take the motorcycle and go wherever you wanted was like, are you kidding me? This is amazing. You had to be careful what neighborhood you went in, and because you don't want to get hit with a brick with in the side of your helmet in the middle of the night. But
there he goes.
Yeah, exactly. Or if you go somewhere, you don't do loops. You just go once, and then by the time they see you, you're gone.
Yeah.
But I will say this: the it was kind of not a complimentary comment, but they used to call me the free safety of patrol because I was a super active officer. And so going into traffic, to me, you had run of the city. And that's what, to me, made it magical because you could go anywhere you wanted and nobody questioned you. So if there was a shooting in the West End, I was there. If there was a stabbing on the South Side, I was there. There's a melee up on the North End, East Side, I'm rolling in. And I mean, some of my best arrests were in traffic for that reason, because I had the ability to rove around. And for someone that has the ADHD that I do, it made it great because, as much as you love your post and you love your team, sometimes that post can feel a little claustrophobic, where even just to be able to go to a certain restaurant, like, oh, you want to grab dinner tonight? I want to go to that place over here. Well, I'm not crossing the city to go get a taco from that place, whereas now I can do that. Don't get me wrong. You knew on a winter night when it's snowing, on a night when it's raining, as you're getting ready to go to work, you already know you're putting a full 8 hours in. Like, it's going to be no rest for the wicked, and you're going to be catching calls before you even punch in. But then there were other nights too, warm summer nights where for whatever reason there weren't accidents, and you were a really great help. So if you were good at your job, people really learned to appreciate you because, like I said, they changed that policy. And so not everybody was used to doing their own accident reports. So you could make a friend, or if somebody didn't treat you right and didn't help you out, like for instance, you show up at an accident, there's 9 cars involved and they've been sitting there for 30 minutes and the officer hasn't even gotten anybody's license to start writing names down.
That could be annoying.
The next time that officer has a big accident, you might mysteriously find that I'm tied up, and that you're going to have to eat that one. So, the system had a way of working itself out. But I will say I learned an amazing appreciation for the intelligence side of police work there. You had to learn the laws. I became a DUI instructor, and that actually was the beginning of my teaching career, which led me to where I am today. I realized that I really enjoyed being in that environment. I enjoyed learning. I enjoyed teaching as well. And I really, I learned so much, not just about traffic and about police work, but about especially, and it's things that you don't think about. It's so intricate, when you talk about a fatal accident or a serious accident, when you're doing reconstructions, when even down to just, using radar guns and all the different calibrations you have to do. I mean, when there was one attorney, when we would do DUI cases, and obviously they're super involved, there were attorneys that would take, at that time, was a $10,000, $5,000, $10,000 retainer, which is probably 3 times that now. And they would ask you like 100, 150 questions. And you had to be good. You had to be on your feet. You had to be smart, not only to win the case, but the other part was the traffic court was very small. So you were always appearing in front of the same attorneys and the same judges. So if you tripped all over yourself in one case, not that they were supposed to remember that, but they did. Or if you did worse, then you were persona non grata. But, learning to testify, learning how to do all the paperwork, that really helped me a lot later when I got to detectives, because there was a lot that I just didn't understand and took for granted. And honestly, it was just being foolish at that time. But I really, really appreciated traffic. And most of the really good cops, at least in my generation, at one point or another, found their way in the traffic unit. So it was really, really great. And I actually pushed a few of the people that I had working for me into that because they had a propensity for it. Plus, even though we didn't really think about it in the first part of our career, when I got toward the end, even though I didn't know where I was going to wind up, I knew that there was something after life after here. And that was what I was trying to set the younger officers up for, was even though you don't understand it now, when you get this feather in your cap and you become a certified whatever, or an accident reconstructionist, when 10 years later, when you're looking to retire, I was talking to guys that had left and they were just patrol officers, but they had that background and they were making 6-figure jobs, and 6-figure jobs were hard to come by. So, I was always trying to set my team up with that. But I will say I was humble enough to admit openly to my lieutenant years later that yes, I did in fact love traffic, and much to my chagrin, but I was more than happy to be honest.
Oh, of course. And the thing is, you talk now with cops coming on the job about know your district, and that's important. That's a great assignment because forget know your district, know your city. You get to go everywhere. And even if you're not regularly in those neighborhoods, if you have to go there again for a certain call, like you were talking about earlier, it's going to come back to you. Oh, yeah, it's off the corner there where there's that convenience store, and there's usually those guys hanging out, and they like to play dice or whatever. It comes back to you the more time you spend there.
You're
And
exactly right.
after a while, it's muscle memory. You don't have to think twice about it. It just comes with time. And it's not only going to help you, but if that, to your point, if you're working with somebody new and they're trying to learn the city, that knowledge is critical that you're able to pass down as well. So it's a great assignment from that standpoint. And thanks for going into it. And this also segues into the rifle team too. Now, is this special operations SWAT style stuff that you were doing, or is it something entirely different?
What I was involved in, no, it was they opened it up. So it wasn't necessarily a specialized unit. It was they handpicked certain officers that were selected to carry the AR-15, and you had to go through obviously all the training that was associated with that. I love that. Obviously from the Marines, having an M16, there were a lot of similarities. Having a rifle, I really enjoyed having a rifle. Plus, I was always of the mind, like the old Amex commercials. It's better to need and not have than to have and not need, or whatever. I said it backwards. But I after having seen like the LA bank robbery and some other things, I'm like, you know what? Even though some people thought it was kind of a pain that you had to go through a lot of extra steps of getting set up and taken down, and things that it wasn't as easy to move around as someone that just had to grab their bag and go. But I always appreciated having a shotgun. That used to be something that you could volunteer to take. I always took the shotgun. I loved having that because for people that don't know, I don't know how many times, even in the middle of a huge melee, there's something about when you rack around that everybody can hear that no matter what's going on around you, which is a really powerful statement. So, but I was always of the mind of I'd rather have more firepower, just in case things go sideways. Because working most of my career in the night shift and a good chunk of that on the overnight, there was nobody coming. They weren't calling out the SWAT team at 4 in the morning. I mean, they would, but it's going to take them an hour to get there. Even though Rhode Island's small and everybody isn't that far away, it's not like some of these departments where they're actually on shift, and they just call them out and they get in the Bearcat and roll out. That wasn't the situation for us. So I thought it was a great opportunity not only to keep myself safe, but God forbid to be an extra weapon that could help somebody else go home. At the end of the day, that was really was most important.
Of course, and that's the thing. Sometimes it is just you, so you learn self-sufficiency and you learn survival skills. You hear it a lot. There's a saying in the fire service, and I always argue it's just as applicable to law enforcement. You can never learn enough about a job that can kill you. And listen, unfortunately he was off duty, but he was possibly promoted to sergeant right after you got on the job, early 2000. Sergeant Young gets killed off duty. He's trying to intervene in a weapons dispute, and unfortunately they thought he was a suspect and he got killed. So and 5 years after that, right before he joined the detective bureau, a detective possibly promoted to detective sergeant was attacked by a suspect in the interrogation room and shot and killed. So it's a job that can change on a whim. You don't know what each call is going to bring. Why not, generally speaking, add more to your arsenal? Why not cross-train in certain respects? You hope you never have to use it, but you want to know how to use it.
Exactly. Yeah, and that was a unique experience too. Not that had anything to do with Jimmy Allen, but I remember being in detectives at that time, and he was killed in our detective office. It was an interrogation he was doing, and long story, but the suspect wound up getting a hold of his gun, and it was just a terrible situation. But that's a room that we walked by and sat in, and it was forever different for me. Even though they changed the walls and the carpet and all that stuff, it was just, to me, it was very eerie. And that was just a very tragic situation. But like you say, you never know, and that's one of the painful reminders that we had more than that. We buried too many people, and that was a really big deal for us, to try to learn from those things, get better. And as much as it hurt, because it definitely hurts, you know, and those people can't come back. And when you see the ripple effect of the impact that has on their family, on their friends, on the community, it's really powerful. And it's sad that it takes that sometimes for us to feel that way.
Yeah, no, and I can see your point, because even if you change things around in there, you say to yourself, you know, a man died in there. Like, a man lost his life in the line of duty in there. So it's sobering, you know. And
he
even
was
just
a friend, and Jimmy
right.
was a nice guy. He was just a super nice guy, you know,
Yeah.
and everybody loved him. And isn't that always how it is? You know, like, you never hear someone say, "Oh, that guy was a jerk," you know, like,
it's always your best guys.
Always.
It's always your best guys. And being a detective too, I mean, listen, you love the street, but there's also the patience factor. I mean, you're very high octane. It doesn't take long in this interview for me to see that. That's a compliment. That's not a detriment to you at all. You need to be in this line of work.
Thank you.
But sometimes, and veteran detectives can help with this, I feel, there's the patience factor. You know, you got a real bad guy. You got a real jerk. Let's just take this guy off the street. Look at what he's doing. We know he's slinging dope. We know he's a contract killer. We know he did that stabbing the other day at that nightclub. Come on, we know. Let's just go get him. But there's the patience in building a case, because, yeah, we know he's doing these things. We want to make sure when we get him, he doesn't have an out. His lawyer, no matter how slick his attorney may be, can't get him out any which way. Everything is ironclad, to the bone, shut, case closed. He's got no way out. That on paper, or at least being said out loud, is a lot easier than executing in real time, especially when you're somebody that likes to run and gun. Tell me about that mental shift for you.
That was very difficult for me. And I'm not going to lie, Mike, I got into a lot of trouble for that reason. I think I had already had like the longest police car chase to go to Boston one night. And so I think I set the second longest record. I went like halfway to Hartford. And I paid dearly for it, but it was, it was a red ball squirrel, you know, and I had to touch the hot stove and get burned. But I thought it was just, you know, they're trying to put me into a box, or these guys are lazy. And what I didn't understand is exactly what you said. Not to say that some of them weren't that way, but it was a different speed. You know, like, we're not racing the calls, we're not running and gunning. And, you know, as I look back now, I'm even smiling because my partner and I, most detectives dress with animals. You know, they shop at, you know, they're buying the $20, off the rack. So we had suits. I had fancy shoes, like way ridiculous, right? It was like Miami Vice. And but we would like get into a foot chase, you know, or some melee, and then we would be standing there, like, you know, making sure the tie is still fixed, right? Nice, shoes are good. We used to get ribbed for it, but we took a lot of pride in that. Because we were still showing up in the same houses and going in those same apartments and going upstairs in the basements and all these, and reaching in, you know, so we weren't being pretty boys either. We just thought our fashion sense was brought a different level to the game. But what made me smile as you were saying that is I have a really great memory of being new with Mike Solelli, was one of my mentors, great street cop. And one night the gas station gets robbed. And they take the register drawer, and I'm flying all around. Right? I'm looking, and I see Mike is parked at this corner. And but the third time I went by him, I said, I had to pull in, like, maybe something's going on. Like, because I'm like, what's he doing? Why is he just sitting here? And I said, Mike, what's going on? And he was like, I forget exactly what he said, but he basically said, like while you're racing around, just hang out. You know, and it was kind of reminiscent of, if you've ever seen the movie Colors, you know, like the two bulls up at the top of the hill, and like, why do we run down, kind of a thing. And so, I mean, you can't make this stuff up. As I'm sitting there, sitting with him, I actually turned around, so we're both facing out. Even though inside I was like, oh my God, I was dying to just put the hammer down and go somewhere. And but he was a senior man. I had respect for that. So he obviously knows what he's doing. And like, literally, like, a minute later, there goes the car. I'm like, are you kidding me, right? And there was a moment there, you know, so very valuable lesson learned. I had to unfortunately relearn that lesson later. You know, same thing as a sergeant. I did the same thing as a sergeant, and I had it happen to a couple of my sergeants when I was a lieutenant, where I have to pull them aside and go, listen, I get it, but when you're the sergeant, you know, in the East End, I don't need you chasing cars in the West End. right? Because you're a sergeant now, and that team needs you to be there as the supervisor. And having to explain that, when I had made those same mistakes, it cut both ways, because sometimes it was, well, you're a hypocrite. And I'm like, no, I'm not, because I learned from that. Someone had the same conversation with me, right? I've made this mistake. But you have to understand the perspective. And I don't think it was as dramatic when I went to lieutenant, because things on an operational level changed very dramatically. You know, where now you're running the station. It wasn't the same, where as a sergeant, even though you're in charge, you're out on the street, you're following in on calls, you're driving around doing your thing. So it was a little bit different in a different way, but that was a really powerful message to deliver. You know, like there's one particular sergeant I can think of, was, again, same, high octane, as you say, task force guy. I mean, just every night was cops on steroids. And then he became a sergeant, and he was kind of doing the same thing. And he's not the only one, but he was the first one that I had encountered. And I was trying to be polite and say to him, he'd even worked for me at one point. And I'm like, hey man, you can't do this. And he kind of kept doing it, and doing it, you know, in a way that he didn't think I'd find out, but I knew what he was doing. And I'm like, listen, I know what you're doing and I get you, but look at one of these kids. And I just happened to pick, you know, the weakest link in his chain. And I said, so now you're 20 minutes away from when he needs you for something, right? So what's happening over there is not your responsibility. What's happening over here is. And, you know, it took him a little while to kind of get adjusted to that thought process, the same way it did for me. But eventually you settle in. I think the trick is having someone that you respect and you have a relationship with that can be honest and tell you that in a way that you can receive it.
Of course. You know, like I said, it goes back to just having been there. And we talked about mental shifts earlier. There was that when you made detective, when you made sergeant in 2013, there's that again, because it's always an interesting evolution where, of course, to a degree, when you're out there, you're worried about the safety of your colleagues, but it's not your direct responsibility. It's only your responsibility to a point. Not that you don't care, of course you do, but your philosophy, not you specifically, but in general as well, there's a sergeant for that. There's a lieutenant for that. There's people above me in charge of those things. And then in 2013, you became the guy in charge of those things on the street, where going back to having been there, you know what works, you know what doesn't. You see, I'm sure, a lot of cops that resemble you and remind you of you, where talk about that line of, okay, I want you guys to be aggressive. I want you to know I got your back. But at the same time, understand that sometimes for your own good, even if you don't understand it, I have to pull you back.
There were two conversations that I had with a number of my officers through the years. The first one was when I was a sergeant, and I said the same thing just in a different way as a lieutenant, was, you know what the space shuttle is, right? Sure. You know, on the front of the space shuttle, they have those heat tiles. So as they're re-entering the atmosphere, that's what takes all the heat so that the astronauts don't burn up inside. Sure. Think of me as those heat tiles. And I would always let it pause for a second and then say, by the way, that doesn't mean that we're both not going to burn up together, right? I'm just going to burn up first. So I'll take the bullet for you, but it might go through me and take you out too. So whatever that's worth, you know, we'll be holding hands, but we're both going to be dealt the same fate. So that was my way of letting them know I'm not going to hang you out there. Now, having said that, I remember, you know, one of the ones that I had alluded to earlier is about car chases. And I mean, listen, anyone that's a good street cop will tell you, car chases are awesome. They are the most fun that you could ever have. And the reason why, I mean, anything that you do, looking back through my career, anything that you do to get you as close to death without dying, we call that exciting, because something's definitely wrong, right? But as you start to consider the dynamic, like you just mentioned, and what I mean by that is, as an officer, you only have to worry about you, right? So if I'm in a car chase and I'm chasing somebody, whether I'm right, wrong, or indifferent, and I get hurt, it's my own fault, because that's me. But as a supervisor, and it was really difficult the few times that I had to call chases off for a variety of reasons. And, you know, and then naturally the officer would be upset. And I remember one in particular, and he said to me, you know, you have like the record for the 2 longest chases in the history of the department. Like, how dare you, you know, tell me this? And I say,
you understand me. Yeah,
right. And I'll smile and let them know secretly, I love it, you know. But as a supervisor, I said the difference is same thing I'd say to them. You're only thinking about you. What you're not thinking about is, God forbid, I mean, we're not even talking about an innocent person getting hurt or any of those types of things. I said, God forbid something happens to you. Like my old partner in housing, Max Storley, God rest his soul, got killed in a car accident responding to an officer calling for assistance. And I said, I don't want to have to face your family, because the same family that you go home to and tell them these awesome stories about all these exciting car chases that you were in and they love them, the first thing that they're going to say when they see me is, especially knowing that that wasn't, according to policy, they're going to say, why didn't you call it off? If you had called it off, my son, my husband, my father would still be here. And that's the difference. And I don't know that it completely let me off the hook with them, but it certainly took the steam up, out of their engine, as far as them being upset with me. And then I wound up meeting an officer, a state trooper from the Midwest years later, and he told me this great story that I recounted many, many times of this wild car chase. They were going all over the place, right? And at the end, the car wrecks. He gets out, and as he's running over to go and take the bad guy into custody, he looks over and he realizes the bad guy hit his family and killed his wife and one of his kids.
Oh my gosh.
And as he told the story, it was, the way he told it was, is it worth your family? Would you give up your wife and your kid? Like, for anybody? No, you wouldn't. So, and in this day and age, the other difference too is in my time, 100 years ago, when we rode horses, right? Like, bad guys took off for a reason. They took off because they absolutely had a gun, or they were wanted for murder or robbery or whatever. It got to the point when I became a supervisor, and probably, from what I understand, it's still this way now, is people will take off for anything. They'll just because I have a suspended license, or maybe I'll get lucky, or I'll never forget one chase we had where we chased this kid all around. He had shot a bunch of people, and he wrecks, we catch him, right? And as we're stuffing him in the car, he's yelling at us saying, you weren't supposed to chase me. Like, you weren't supposed to do that. That's not against your mouth, which he was wrong. But either way, it was the point that was his mindset. So the difference was, when somebody took off on you in 1999, 2000, 2001, it was for a real good reason, whereas now they're doing it for anything. And, yeah, right. Or just because, maybe let me see what this guy does. And that's even up until now with the phones the way they are. Half the time they're trying to lure you in and get you in problem situations. So it's even more dangerous. But at the end of the day, that's what I used to try to remind them of. And it's hard because it's. I mean, I had to call myself off of my own once, and even as I say it, I get like this thing. But you know what? That to me shows a level of maturity. And that's what I kept telling myself is if you still want to be that person, then don't be a supervisor. Don't be the one that's going to lead your team off a cliff. Right. You have a different responsibility now. You have a responsibility for their safety. You have a responsibility for their career, because even if they don't get hurt, if they get in trouble, that doesn't help that you get in trouble too. No one cares about that.
It doesn't accomplish anything.
So it was a really delicate act of explaining why I did what I did. I think they appreciated that, because another thing that I learned very much through my career is there was, in many cases, very few supervisors giving what I call commander's intent. They would never explain their decision. It was just because I said so. And even asking why, even inquisitively asking why, was seen as a sign of disrespect. And, to a point, I remember teaching a class for the FBI NAA years ago, and there's a chief in this class, and he had been on the job like 50 years. And funny, he had a sergeant with him, and the sergeant at one point, when I asked about getting promoted, he said, I can't until this guy leaves. And so later on, as I'm giving an example of the difference between the generations. And the older generation, there was no asking questions. Like when I got on the job, you stand in the back, you shut up. The expression was, you act according to the amount of time you have on the job. So if you've been on the job for 6 months, act like you've been on 6 months. If you've been on 2 years, act like you've been on 2 years. If you've been on a year, don't act like you've been on 10. And actually, the last article I wrote for Police One, I talked about that, was what the expression that I learned from the Sub 1 guys was, these boots have more time on the street than you do, kid, right? So don't tell me about whatever. And that was an interesting dynamic of having to teach the next generation of understanding that, and the older generation too, because now I have these senior sergeants that don't want to hear about, whatever, some social media app. They weren't into that stuff. So to them, it was still like, you might as well say F you to say why. Whereas I was demonstrating with this chief, and I said about explaining why. And the example that I used as I was telling the story is, if you're the sergeant and you're at roll call and you have to ask one of your officers to go by a particular house and tag a car for illegal parking. And, of course, who wants that assignment, right? There's nothing exciting about that. And I said, now, what if I then added to that, the reason why I'm sending you by is because it's an elderly couple that live there, and they both have significant health issues. And this one young neighbor always blocks their driveway, and the van that they need to get in to go to see their doctor's appointments and do other things can't get in. So it basically destroys their whole life where they're trapped. Okay. And in that example, I said to the chief, so if somebody says why, and I didn't even get the question out, and he sounded like an old Chevy starting on a cold winter morning, like, right? Because I could already see him like wanting to backhand this officer, and other younger cops are looking like, what is this guy talking about? Because they didn't get it. So I was explaining it to both sides at the same time. And I said to the younger guys, as we're talking about this, listen to the tone of my voice, right? So I'm going to say the same words, but they're two different things. One is, hey, why? The other one is, why? Two different responses, right? I said, so the older generation hears everything as the second one, and the younger ones think everything is the first one. So it was a moment for both of them to kind of learn from each other. And, that's definitely a thing that is, I'm sure.
A bit of a gap.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's been just a bit.
It hurts because there's that middle gap left, right? That you have the senior buffer. People that have gone 30 plus years that have nowhere else to go. And then the people that were in the 20-ish that could still, people like myself, I had 23 years on. I was still in my 40s, my early 40s. So I could still go and have another career. Whereas they were kind of stuck in their ways. So the junior class of the high school, if you will, left. So now you got the freshmen, the sophomores, and the seniors, and nobody to kind of bridge the gap in between. And that group that I was a part of, those are the sergeants, those are the lieutenants, those are the buffer, those are the senior officers that have that leadership authority, even though, and you know what I mean, just because someone doesn't have rank. Even as a supervisor, there were certain officers that when I rolled up to a scene, I'd be like, what do you got? Not, hey, I'm in charge, I'm the sergeant, let me tell you. It was out of respect for that officer because of how long they've been on the job. They knew what they were doing. They forgot more than I needed to learn. So it was more powerful for me to be humble and show them respect instead of me feeling like I had to show off in front of them. And, look at me, I'm a heavy sleeves, big sergeant guy, which was ridiculous. And it didn't work either, if you tried to do that.
Right, because they like you said, those guys could easily look at you and say, "I got shoes over you, kid," and you didn't want to go down that road with them if you didn't have to. And not doing it is one of the smarter decisions that you can make. And it's funny because as you mentioned cops, that opening, part of the opening, and for the beat profiles of police nationwide, takes a clip from Providence when they filmed over there in 1996, 1997. One of those guys that's yelling, "Don't go, don't go!" That's Fabio Zuena. And it's funny because I looked up, I'm like, I wonder what Fabio's up to these days because they featured him a lot. He ended up becoming a sergeant. So
yeah,
I'm sure
he's still there. He was a detective sergeant when I was there. Great cop. I didn't catch it in the clip, but was it the one where he T-bones the guy and says, "Oh, look, he hit me." We used to laugh about that one all the time. He just crushes this car, and he's like, "Oh, look," because he knows the camera's recording. Matter of fact, I think after cops came that one time, because my cousin Eddie had one that was just as awesome. And I think the chief forbid them from ever coming back because it just so happened that all the wildest stuff was happening only when the cops' cameras were rolling. The good old days.
I don't know. I don't think it was that one. I think this is the pursuit he had where the guy was going on the sidewalk. So they were trying to box him in. I think they did eventually end up boxing him in, but he was trying to, because he was the lead officer on it. So he's yelling. He's like, "No, don't go," because he wants him to stay in that area boxed in. But they went. The guy was able to get a little bit further. So I mean, again, and that he was an aggressive cop. I'm sure, as obviously evidenced by those clips, and I'm sure he had to have those conversations too. The
Yep.
transition, I mean, and it's interesting because most guys say, sergeant to lieutenant's a little bit easier because been there, done that. I've been in the rank of, a little bit in terms of having authority over other officers, I should say. So I've learned how to manage that. But you mentioned something interesting earlier. Let's go back to it. Lieutenant presented some new challenges because you were, as you said, running a station. Maybe expand on that, please.
Yeah, it was a huge difference. And and maybe it was just because of the way my department is set up. I'm not sure. But the first thing that happened was, so I'll compare the two in parallel. When I first became a sergeant, the first thing that I thought of was, when you show up, it's like, okay, I was fortunate. Even when I was in detectives, I was always out on the road and I worked nights. So I knew almost everybody pretty well, or better, and I'd worked with a lot of them. So the transition wasn't as extreme for me. There were some people that had been, in a specialized unit for years and literally didn't even know who some of the officers were, because again, we're at a big department, and we had different substations, so you could go a while, even on the same shift, without seeing another officer for whatever reason. So to hear people say that is just kind of wild, because when I first became a sergeant, even though I still had moments of that imposter syndrome, or I didn't know what to do, you had other sergeants around, you had your lieutenant there. There was a support network. Even though you were on your own, you weren't live without a net. I'll never forget the first night being alone as the commanding officer, and then it kind of, the weight hits you that you realize, I'm it. Like, any other shift, there's captains, majors, the chief, like, you're it. You are the senior person. You are acting as the chief. If there's a chase, it's not up to, that lieutenant better call it off. It's you. You're the man. You're making the decisions. And trust me, it was like you couldn't even go to bed when you got home in the morning, because even if it was a good night, there would inevitably be 2 or 3, 4 phone calls about what happened on the overnight as the day shift came in, and they start unfolding everything of looking at, arrest packages and so on. So that was the first one, because I didn't feel it nearly at all as a sergeant, for a lot of the reasons, like I said. But as a lieutenant, it was totally different, and I didn't see that coming at all. The weight of it, of just sitting in that room, I mean, part of me was like, oh my God, they left me in charge. Do they know what the hell they're doing? Yeah, right? Like, they are dumb. But then the other part of me is like, then you want to step into that role. And I know obviously everybody probably felt similar in the same situation, but the weight of it was heavy, and that was before anything happened. Then all of a sudden, now you have sergeants calling you and they're asking you questions, whereas before it was just, again, it was your team, your crew of however many people. Now it's the whole shift. So right. Now you're getting 2 calls at the same time. There's a shooting over here, there's a domestic over here. These decisions, everything's happening fast. And I don't want to go down a rabbit hole on it, but the thing that I think a lot of people never talk about, and I felt it for most of my career, is the sleep deprivation and what it does to you, and the way it affects your decision making, the way it affects your mental acuity, your nimbleness, being able to make multiple decisions or go through a shift. Because again, as an officer, you make 1 or 2. As a sergeant, you make 3 or 4. As a lieutenant, you're making 50. And it starts from the moment you sit in the chair to who's going. It was your job to plug everybody in, making sure that staffing was right. Catching up on what happened the shift before, what's coming next. So it was really involved. And you were on your own, and there was a lot of figuring it out for yourself that I didn't see coming, and maybe I should have. I just, like you said, I assumed, I've done this before. It's no big deal. I got promoted once. It's the same, and it was completely different.
And let's stay on that, because you know what? There's a lot of trial and error, and with that comes growth, and with that comes perspective, and better understanding. Okay, I should probably do this next time. Let's take out, because you made lieutenant in 2019. Let's take out the craziness of 2020. Let's say no pandemic, no civil unrest, all that. Let's just remove that from the equation. By the time you decided to hang it up a couple of years later in 2022, just focusing on that period in your career alone was the main reason burnout. Because even if you learned and you found your footing after a while, it gets to be a lot, especially when so many decisions are falling on one person.
Yeah, for me, I don't know it was necessarily burnout. I mean, I guess you could call it that in a way. And I'm going to be completely honest with you, Mike. We were in Providence is a very, very liberal city. It's a very, in a lot of ways, and
Pretty much all of New England.
Yeah, I think Providence has a stronghold, I think, on that in particular. You know, especially politically, which, listen, is great. You know, that's what this country was built on, is having both sides of everything. I think we might have taken a little extreme there, but there was a lot of stuff going on at the time politically that made it extremely challenging for all of us as officers, and it made it even more difficult for the supervisors. And I felt it even more. There were incidents that officers were involved in that were being looked at as a criminal act when they clearly were not. I mean, I'm going to call it what it is. They were people that they were gunning for. At one point, you know, I was one of them, and that's uncomfortable. That's not a fun type of environment to be in. And when you find yourself in a position where you're watching officers get mistreated, things be mishandled, and you should be in a position to fix them and make them better, and you can't, it becomes extremely challenging. And for me, I used to tell a lot of guys, you know, I did a lot of like retirement type of transitioning, because I noticed that there didn't seem to be a whole lot of support for officers as they were leaving the department. And as you know, obviously we keep in touch with people that we worked with after they leave, and I noticed that was the thing. And so I leaned into that a lot. But the reason why I say that is because now I'm watching young officers that are smart, aggressive, and one in particular, they sucked the life out of the guy. You know, they completely took a situation that he was involved in and spun it into something that it wasn't. And I don't want to say it ruined him, but the look in his eyes, like the fire was gone, and it broke my heart. And that was just one example. But I also heard myself saying to a lot of other officers, once you get to the point where you're not comfortable adjusting to the way things need to be, that's a red flag that it's time to go. And there were a couple of little things that happened that told me it's my time. I was very, very fortunate at that particular time to have a very amazing opportunity to create a course for the FBI National Academy Associates and be flown around the country teaching for them, which was an amazing, amazing experience. But not too many people have that transition, you know, waiting for them as they're getting ready to leave. So it was very bittersweet for me. But at the end of the day, again, I heard myself saying the same thing that I said to a lot of my officers. You got to do what's good for you. You know, as someone told me when I was in the Marines, you know, contemplating being a pilot and having a career there, the Marine Corps doesn't keep you warm at night. You know, the police department doesn't keep you warm at night. Your family does. And I've said this a million times. I put it at the beginning of my book. My wife easily had the hardest job of anyone in that department. And I remember one particular night coming home, had a really bad night at work. And the moment I walk in the door, you know, she's giving me the business. And I don't want to hear it, but I'm a good husband. I'm taking it on the chin. And I'll never forget one of the things that she said was, I kind of pushed back, like, can you give me a minute? Like, just let me get in the house, right? Like, before I got to hear about it. And she's like, you know what? These effing kids that you got, I'd rather be dealing with crackheads and murderers. And and it was so dramatic the way she said it. But she was right. She was right. There was a lot more going on, because I was dumb enough to think I was invincible, as a lot of us are. And I wound up finding out the hard way more than once that I was not. And I realized that's got to be really difficult. You know, it's difficult for me. Like, I missed, you know, that time with them, obviously, but it had to have been worse, because I always believed that I was gonna be fine. And then, you know, when eventually the family realized that you're not wearing a cape under your vest, you know, that you are human and that bad things can happen, that changes the dynamic, and you realize that the sacrifices that your family makes for you to do this job. You know, I don't think a lot of people think about that.
And that's, yeah. And sometimes they're the ones that suffer the most. You know, it takes a lot out of you, the individual actually out there on the street doing the job, but it takes just as much out of them too. Because I mean, inevitably, even if there's not drastic changes, you do change. You know, you do see a lot of things go down. And we said we would talk about it earlier in the show. We'll talk about it now. You mentioned, you know, after a while, the trauma builds up. And that's a huge part of what you're doing now with AIO. And just tell me about, you know, that the culmination of different things over the years building up. And of course, segue it into this and what you're doing now and how to help others.
Yeah, well, I can speak specifically to it. The one that really tipped the scale for me was February of 2002. I was in the traffic unit at the time, and there was a huge melee. There was one all night, or there was one restaurant that was near all the nightclubs downtown that was allowed to had an all night license, so it will stay open until like 4 or 5 in the morning. And naturally, everybody left every bar and club and went to this one place because it was the only place to go. It was that and Fighters, which is the other one where Cornell Young had his incentive. So I wound up getting down there. It was, I think there were a couple people stabbed, somebody shot. It was like a gang thing, whatever. And you know, I mean, there were a couple hundred people there. And long story short, I find out that one of the people we thought was with the suspect crew had a video camcorder and was recording everything. So I went over to talk to him about it. We wound up getting into a struggle. We wind up on the ground. Next thing I know, one of the first things that happened is my radio gets sheared off. I mean, it's an inch thick steel, gone. So it skids across the ground immediately. Within seconds, I can't call for help. I have the guy on top of me, and next thing I know, I can feel somebody reaching for my gun. So a couple of his friends came over, and as I'm trying to now keep my gun in the holster, and the other guy's kicking me in the head with these steel-toe boots, and I'm taking it. I'm getting worked, and I'm literally hanging out for dear life. Like this is the fight for life. Eventually, at one point, I'm able to disengage. Everybody gets up and runs. I wound up chasing and grabbing one of the guys. We eventually caught all three later, but the reason why I tell the story is because, and I'll fast forward through a lot of it because I don't want to bore everybody to death, but
no, you're not.
I remember at one point coming home one morning, and you know, I wasn't a big drinker, and I was down at the FOP bar, and there was this old battle axe, you know, a woman that had been there like 100 years, and she's like, "Kid, what are you doing here? Like, you don't belong here." She's like, "The guy that you're talking to that is giving you life advice is on his 5th marriage, bro. Like, take your stuff and go home. Like, get out of here. You're not going to solve your problem here." So I leave, and as I get home, my wife had packed all of my stuff up, and she said, "You need to go get help, because if you don't, I can't do this." And I was totally blown away. I had no idea what was going on. I didn't know what was happening. You know, obviously looking back in hindsight, I had all kinds of issues. It was like 16 lesions on my brain. I had broken bones all over the place, but I looked pretty good, you know, and that was the part that threw everybody. And what really brought it to another level was, and part of it's my own fault, because, you know, naturally when I would come home and my wife, first thing she'd always do is look at my hands, right? You got bloody knuckles and you're all torn up. Obviously you got involved in something, and I didn't really look that bad. And she was like, So, you know, like I always do, kind of took a little off the top, right? And downplayed the scenario so it didn't sound as bad as it really was. Well, short time later, we find out unceremoniously, we're sitting there at home. My son had just been born. He's just a baby at the time. And we're watching TV, and I'm still home recovering. And a video clip pops up, coming up live at 11. Providence police officer, you know, assaulted, whatever. And they show a clip. Now, no one knew that there was a video of this. And where the incident occurred, there was a college student that lived in a dorm that overlooked this area that had been given a Christmas gift of a camcorder, which at the time, for those of us, right, this is pre-cell phones and everything, right?
Late 90s, early 2000s.
Yeah, when we rode horses and, you know, read books with candles. So, you know, being in that situation at that particular time, this was a very weird situation for me, because again, you know, I had just come from the Marines right before this, right? And I had been in a million fights in my life. That was just the way I grew up, but
Right.
I was never really on the wrong end of it like that. And there were multiple levels to that. First of all, I was pissed, right? I'm upset because now the department knew that there was a video and they didn't tell me. So now I'm frantically trying to call my grandparents, like anybody that would watch this, because now they're going to have a heart attack and think that something happened to me, not realizing that it was old. And so that was a whole other level on top of it all. But now it was, and it got sold to the network. So it was being shown like all over the country. It was I felt embarrassed. It was like getting your ass kicked and then the whole country gets to watch. You know, that wasn't, and so the things that I took from that, there were two really important things. The first one was the way the department responded. And so again, I'm just telling you a super long story, real short. At the end of all of my injuries had healed, and I had finally been talked into going to see a psychiatrist, and that's a whole story into itself, because you just will yourself better, right? That's what I referred to at the beginning about the Marines, right? You just suck it up, buttercup.
Lock
right?
in.
Yeah, right. And I mean, have a drink, whatever, fill in the blank. But there's no like, you don't sit around and feel sorry for yourself. You get up and go and you just keep rocking. So being in that environment, and I'll never forget going to see this neurosurgeon, and he was telling me all these weird things that were going wrong with me. And he's like, this is happening. And I'm like, how does he know this stuff? And he's pointing up at a thing. He goes, well, because that's the way your brain works. And this is the part of the brain that does this. And this is the part of the brain that does that. And I think that helped me at first, for sure, because as dumb as it might sound, hearing a doctor explain that a lot of the things that were happening to me were physical, that kind of helped my ego, I guess you could say. Like, you're not weak-minded, you're not soft, right? That's the way your body responds. That's what, when they talk about PTSD, that's the reaction. It's because your brain thinks that you're going to die, and it's trying to avoid that. So it's, you have to learn all about that stuff. So as I get in and I'm talking to the therapist, he was an amazing guy, helped me enormously, and I get a letter that says a call and letter that says you're going to come back to work. And so he sends a letter that says, hey, listen, we're not done yet. He's not ready. And they basically said, if you don't show up to work tonight, you're going to be AWOL, and you don't come in for a couple nights, and then we're going to move to fire you. And at that time, that was a lot. That I didn't feel supported in that sense. Even though I learned later what was really driving that was the city was terrified of officers being able to use, an injury or PTSD or stress or whatever to take a pension. That was their only concern. They didn't care about anything else. So not that it made it any better, especially at that time, but again, I was incredibly fortunate because I did come back to work, and being young and maybe a little naive, all the guys that I worked with, they said, hey, there was this one particular area we would meet up and have coffee or whatever, and so they tell me to meet them there. And so one night I'm sitting there and we're all hanging out, and then a call comes in and I go, and one of the senior guys goes, no, you just hang with me. Doesn't say anything else. And this continues through the night. Fine. I'm like, all right, something's up. Second night, same thing. By the third night, I'm like, guys, what's happening? And then, because I didn't even realize what they were doing, they were protecting me. They knew that I wasn't ready. And they told me this later, and they said, we don't want you to overreact, and we don't want you to underreact. We know you're not ready, and that's cool. And that was the second thing that really helped me. And the third that really put me over the top was I was super fortunate that as I'm watching this video of me getting my ass kicked on national TV, that a couple of people that I really, really respected and appreciated and looked up to came to me and told me stories where they had gotten beaten up or they had been on the wrong end of an incident. And one was my cousin, and he had talked about after Stephen Shaw was killed in the line of duty that, he's going to a gun call shortly thereafter, and he thinks he's having a heart attack. And it turns out it's a panic attack. He didn't even know what it was. Went to the hospital. He's like, and then did the connection, right? Now, if him and those other guys didn't have the humility to tell me that, these are tough guys. These are badass cops, right? These are like super cops. So for these guys that I almost glorified to lower themselves, if you will, to me and humble themselves and be vulnerable and say, here's what happened to me one night. And so you're good. That normalized it for me. It totally changed everything. So from that moment forward to this day, like even after the incident at Brown University with the mass shooter over there, you know, I was calling people saying, hey man, are you good? And they were like, no. So this is what happened. I said, no. I don't, if you want to tell me a story, that's cool, but that's not why I'm calling, because I understand, I've been there, and I would share my story, because a lot of people, you know, being of a higher rank, not that I cared, but the dynamic, it made it, I used it to my advantage, because they listen a little better and they say, wow, if this guy is a lieutenant and he's telling me this time to get his ass kicked. But I said it to them to explain to them, it's okay, this is normal, right? What's happening to you is normal. This is what you need to be thinking about going forward. You know, if I knew the person's significant other and it was appropriate, I'd say, hey, just say, if they start acting funny, give me a call, give my wife a call, we'll come help out. You know, this is some things that you might see if you start to, things get weird, let us know. And, you know, not getting into somebody's personal business like that, but just letting them know.
Just being there, letting them know,
yes,
yeah, right.
Exactly. And we got your back. Was a huge deal. And it changed everything for me. And that incident, it easily could have killed me in numerous ways. And because, I mean, looking back, my vice of choice was drinking. I mean, as most cops at the time. And, you know, I was trying to find the solution in the bottom of the bottle. And I got very lucky that I didn't make, you know, any mistakes, any bigger mistakes, or have any bad accidents. But I was very fortunate and I got through it. And I've always been committed to making sure that whenever possible, that I can share that story and be humble and be vulnerable and let them know it's okay. That's what makes you human. That's the part that is so hard for us. The dichotomy of being a cop, of being this superhuman, you know, hero with a cape that's going to save everybody. But it seems like we can save everybody except ourselves. You know what I mean?
Right. And you can step, it doesn't mean you still can't step to the forefront and take charge. But it's important to remember, you're not Superman. You're not Spider-Man. We love those guys. Those guys are cool. You're not Thor. It's okay to, you know, listen, we hear the line said ad nauseum, but it's true. It's okay to not be okay. And you mentioned Stephen Shaw. I mean, again, even though it didn't happen to that, to your cousin directly, what happened to Stephen Shaw was horrendous. For those that don't know, this is 1994. He was on a robbery call. He was a robbery suspect that hid in a closet and ambushed him and shot him and killed him. You know, so and there's a trauma to that too. Like you mentioned earlier with Sergeant Brown, I worked with that guy, or Detective Allen. I knew that guy. He was a good guy. If that can happen to him, it might happen to me. And so what you focused on a lot and what you've been saying, I think, you know, not that I'm shameless plugging, I mean it sincerely, it factors into the overcome aspect of AIO, because, and that's, I mean, listen, not to say adapting isn't important, improvising isn't important. There's different situations that come of fruition in the field that you got to really respond to in real time, both mentally and physically, in what you choose to do or not do. But then there's the aftermath. And as you know, there's, especially with an incident like what you went through back in, this is 2002. This is almost 25 years ago. There's a long aftermath process. And with that, an equally long overcoming process.
Yeah. And it's funny because even better moment, I remember, and I was teaching a class in Texas, and one of the supervisors there, the only way, because of the staffing was so shorthanded, the only way that he could take the course during the day was he had to continue to work his night shift. And which I have the utmost respect for in and of itself. And I had during one of the segments the day before, I had talked about this type of thing, and being a senior officer, regardless of how old you are, you know, be more compassionate. If you see a young officer that seems to be struggling, like we used to joke about it, right? I remember, you know, not to get like over the top of it, but I remember, like, you know, we had just picked up dinner one day and I have a veal parm sandwich, and then I get dumped at a call where they left me in the house with this guy that had blown his head off. So I'm sitting there eating a veal parm sandwich, you know, and they were pointing out how my sandwich looked like what's on the wall, you know, and that's the kind of, you know, the
that's how you go.
That they, but a lot of people that are older, they think that that's funny or whatever, or to do it to the younger generation. And so I had told that story, and I said, if you see somebody that looks like it's not working right, like pull them aside. So the next day, This guy comes in, and he had just gotten promoted to sergeant, and he said, I had an incident last night after we left here. And I show up, and it was a shooting. I think it was like a teenage kid. I forget the exact scenario, but no, it was nothing super crazy. And he says, I show up, and there's this one young officer that is just pale white. I mean, just they look like they're going to pass out and throw up all at the same time. And he says, and I'm sorry, he was lieutenant. He just made lieutenant. And he said, and I heard one of the sergeants walk by and say something to the kid to the effect of suck it up, buttercup, or whatever. And he said, and I thought of what you said. So I said to the kid, hey, come here. I call him over to my car. I get him in there. I give him a water. I'm like, are you all right? And he clearly wasn't. It took me a minute to draw it out of him. But then he explains that an almost identical situation had happened with his brother when he was a kid. And it brought all that back, you know. So it's not even like he was being soft per se. Not that there's anything wrong with being, you know, not being completely comfortable with seeing a kid get shot. But had the sergeant didn't ask, are you okay? It was, he really gave him the old school, you know, attaboy, and that's not going to help. And I was, I don't know who was more moved, the guy telling me the story or me hearing it, because, you know, from a mentor standpoint, it made me feel really good that it works, right? Like that was what I wished had been better during my time. I gave it to him to pay it forward, and he was able to do it the right way, you know. And because as much as that was just a moment, that might be a moment, that might have been a turning point in that officer's career. That might have been something that, or just made their job way better. Or because if you're thinking, not only are they making fun of me for reacting like this, no one even asked me what's going on, because they didn't know, and they just assumed he's just a kid that is uncomfortable being around, you know, a violent situation. So I think there's a lot to be learned there, and quite honestly, Mike, that's the way it should always have been. You know,
Right.
like I get it that that's how we were, but we were savages. We were complete savages to each other, and you know that was the way we lived. But just because we survived it doesn't mean we have to put everybody else through the same thing in order to earn their stripes.
And that's perfectly said, because we're having this conversation on May 27th, 2026. If time machines were real, and anybody that's listened to this program a long time has heard me say that line a lot, it's one of my favorites. Let's go back to May 27th, 1996, and hold up a television screen or an iPad or whatever of what the profession is now, and show a guy on patrol back in 1996 how things are done today, how things are handled today. It's almost like two different jobs. You know, it's almost like two different professions. But that's not necessarily, I mean, some might argue certain aspects might be a bad thing, and that's a different conversation for a different day. But as we've talked about tonight, especially with how to handle these type of events, it's not always a bad thing. You know, especially now in recent years where we're losing a lot of good people, LT. And it's not the battle on the street where, you know, these guys are getting killed in line of duty, although that's still happening, sadly. It's the battle within. That guys look at a gun, and I'm not trying to be graphic, but guys look at a gun and say, shoot, this might be my only way out. You know, I can't take it anymore. You know, because I have to be strong. You know?
Yeah, and that was scary for me. I didn't even realize that fully until I became an instructor with the FBI and AA. I'm putting slides together, realizing like, wow, like more cops die by suicide than by getting shot, and car accidents and all these other things. And the scary part is, at least in my experience, typically that used to be that was the retired guys, that was the older generation, that had people that had been through really extreme situations.
Right, dark
and
stuff.
Now what you're getting is it's happening to younger officers. I mean, it was unheard of years ago to have someone in their early 20s. I remember that high profile incident, I'm going to forget Connor's last name, but I know it was a recent New York NYPD case about a year ago, and the father, I think he was maybe third generation NYPD. Father was a sergeant.
Oh, Colin Rossiter. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, that poor thing. And I remember seeing an interview with the dad, and you know, he's just talking about, and I mean, anyone that's seen the event, it was clean as a whistle. I mean, he pulls up, he's getting fired upon by a guy with a gun. I mean, there was no question about what they did. Was, you know, it wasn't one of these weird ones where everybody's arguing about it. It was very straightforward, clean cut. And it was only a few months later he winds up killing himself. And, you know, people can make jokes and say, oh, the younger generation's soft, this, that, and the other. whatever. I don't even like using that word. It's because the reason or how we got hard was because we went through all the things that we were trying to prevent everyone else from having to go through, and that was kind of a realization for me right before the end of my career as well, being a football coach. I learned more from being a teacher and a football coach, I think, than I did on the job. And one night, coming out of after practice, and there's a kid sitting all by himself in the parking lot, and it's way late. I was cutting up film, so there's no one else around. And I said, you okay? He says, oh, I'm just waiting for my mom. And I said, well, mom was probably supposed to be here like 2 hours ago. Yeah, no, but I can't get hold of her, but she's going to come, and I don't want to make her nervous. And so as we're talking, I said, you want to ride? No, I'm going to wait. I don't want to freak her out. And like, well, where do you live? And he indicates like basically a half a mile away. And in that moment, in my head, I was like, are you kidding me? Like, it never even occurred to that kid, like, I could just walk home. For me, for someone that walked a couple of miles to the bus stop, and I sound like one of those old people, it wasn't uphill,
Back in my day.
both ways, right? But, we didn't have bus stops every 12 feet that let you out at your front door.
Right.
There was one bus stop a half a mile away. But, the point of me saying that was the next day, as I'm talking to the kid's father, the light went off. Like, the helicopter parents, that's us. That's my generation. We're the parents that gave the kids, and we're the ones that blew it up. So I tried explaining it to people afterward, when I was able to put it all together, to say, as a parent, because I have two of my own, and I know exactly how that is. As a parent, you want to protect your kids from all things bad, all things evil, everything difficult. But what you don't really realize is that as much as you don't want them to go through some of the things that you went through growing up, that's what made you who you are. That's why you are as hard as you are. That's why you have the life skills. So if you have a kid and you never allow them to struggle through any type of adversity, they never develop the skill to take care of themselves. So that's when that moment, the light bulb went off. And I said, even if a kid stands on the side of a pool, if they've watched people jump in and swim, that's different. If someone throws them in and they drown, whose fault is it? Is it their fault or is it our fault? It's our fault because we didn't teach them how to swim. So as soon as I reframed that, then it wasn't, even though, yeah, maybe you might be soft, it's not your fault. So that's the whole point, is how can we get this generation exposed to enough eustress, is the actual word from Greek, like a boot camp, right? It's good stress. It's stress that trains you how to respond in a way that you can think through your incident. When I remember the first few times of getting into a huge melee on the job and the adrenaline dump and all that stuff. And I'll never forget one night we're out in front of these nightclubs where it was just set your watch to it, 10 past, and it was going to be a melee and then 10 more. And I'm running up the street. There's a fight 2 blocks away, and I'm running up the street. And the guy that I'm with is a senior guy. He goes, "Hey, where's your hat?" And I'm like, "We never wore hats." I'm like, "Why do I have to wear my hat?" So I don't want to, I'll be respectful. I run back, I grab my hat, and I'm running back, and I get about 50 feet. He goes, "Hey, where's your red pencil?" I'm like, "What the hell are you talking about?" And I turn and I look, and now the fight's over. And he's smiling. And he's like, "You don't get it, huh?" No idea. I lost, right? He says, "They're going to fight. It lasts about 30 seconds, and then it's over. You want to go get involved in fights? You're going to have plenty that you can't get out of. So leave it to those. You get into these extra ones, inevitably, you're going to get dinged, you're going to get hurt, something's going to happen. Let them do what they got to do, and you just kind of roll up nice and slow, and when it's all done and they're tired, then you go, all right, who's coming with me, who's going home?" So there were a lot of maturing lessons that I had to learn too, for your own benefit. And it was a unique experience for sure, but I'm really hoping that someone will hear this and be able to pay it forward to the next generation the way I'm trying to.
Absolutely. And it's been a great almost 2 hours of being able to highlight that.
Wow.
But we're not done just yet. Yeah, I mean, time, like I said, I always say if I'm doing a lot of talking, it's a bad show. But thankfully, I haven't had to do that. And I have guys tell me when we get off here, "Oh, I talk too much." I'm like, yeah, that's the point. I wanted you to. So thankfully, you were able to give a lot of really good information tonight. And I think it's important. It's timely. We've all, I talked about it before the show. People who fell victim to it. I know people who fell victim to it. Mental health as well, especially in this line of work. Especially for those of us that are in the field, for those of us like myself, in my case, trying to be a fireman, trying to get into the field. These are the lessons we need to take with us, because it's not just being the best version of ourselves at the job. It's being the best version of ourselves for those who love us at home. And I think I'm glad you hit on that tonight, because again, it's all too important. It's easy to forget.
And if I recall, you're a dispatcher too, right?
Yes, currently I'm a dispatcher.
Yeah, and I got to tell you, that was a huge thing for me. Again, something that no one ever talks about. I was very fortunate. My training officer, Mike Aimandi, was phenomenal cop. And one of the first things that he did when he trained me was he brought me to the communications division, and he introduced me personally to all the dispatchers. And it was really cool for me, because now I could put a face with the name. And that really served me well for many reasons throughout my career. It was always nice. I think people really take for granted what dispatchers go through and how valuable they are, because we had some amazing dispatchers. We had some terrible ones too.
Yes.
And one almost got me killed one night because they didn't know what they were doing and let their pride get in the way. But luckily, one of the great ones, Dave Sears, was there to save my ass, and it worked out. But I don't know how many times through the years that I would have to listen to an event, and then I would just have that moment of going, oh my God, like we're there, we're in the moment, we can see what's happening. They're just listening. Like, how much harder does that have to be in certain situations, especially when someone's hurt, when someone's calling for help, when someone's in a bad way, and you know it, and you know that person, and you're friends with them. It makes it much harder. So I hats off to you, because I think people take it for granted that you can absolutely be a terrible dispatcher. It is an art and a science. And, some of the ones that we had were some of the best. And because they knew when to talk, they knew when to be quiet, they knew when to tell everyone to shut up. They just knew what to do. They knew how to navigate the situation. And there's just not enough credit that goes to the nuance of the teeny tiny little things that they would do. Even and in that particular thing that I'm thinking about is, the first instinct that cops always have. They hear someone scream and they start screaming, and so we had a different channel. So the thing for us would be go to channel 3, because, and I used to say this forever, is because I was that guy numerous times in my career. I might only get 1 second to come over one time with a plate, a name, a word, a street, whatever. And if you're over here because, 27 going, 26, yeah, just go. That one of the dispatchers, he used to laugh. His expression would be, cars just go. Like, I don't need to know we get it. This guy's in a fight for his life. Everybody across the city is headed there all at once. Cool. Just go, right? Leave the air open so that if he needs to come over with something, that he can, and that he has the opportunity. So nobody cares what laundry list of car numbers are going. Just go, figure it out, and let us know. So I think there's a lot to be said also for the mental health and well-being of dispatchers, because, even from a social standpoint, because I know you guys deal with the same crab pot that we deal with. There are certain people that are just, everything is bad, everything is negative, everything is toxic, and I can get in my cruiser and drive away. You have to sit at the next desk for the whole shift. You don't get to go away. You don't get to leave. So I have a lot of love for the dispatchers out there and for what they go through, because I think in some ways it's even harder not being able to see, just being able to, or just listening and then being caught in the unenviable position of, usually being the scapegoat, unfortunately, in situations for why it didn't go right, so hats off to you for sure.
Thank you. It's been an eye opener again on my pathway to hopefully becoming a firefighter pretty soon. It's been a great way to learn the other side of the coin, and I think that'll help me as I vault into my next profession hopefully pretty soon. But again, as you're saying that, it jogs my memory. Super Bowl Sunday, back in February. I'm working 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. And I, my first call of the day was, hey, I think my car got towed, man. Because we take administrative calls too. Can you run the plate for me and see where it is? Sure, gotcha. Run the plate. Hey, this company's got it. It's at such and such street. Oh, thanks, man. No problem. Have a good Sunday. Enjoy the big game. Next call. My husband's not breathing. His lips are blue. You could hear a little girl crying in the background. And I'm giving her CPR instructions over the phone. I checked the call notes. Fire department got there. EMS got there. He died.
Yeah.
That was my second call of the day. The next call after that, hey, I got this car in front of my driveway. It's blocking it. Just like that.
Yeah.
You know,
Yep.
It's just
And you
like-
have to switch gears, and nobody gets it, you know. And if you're a human, God forbid, you know. And there were times that, as a supervisor, when I could, if somebody was involved in a really big incident, very quietly and very discreetly, I would send them home. I wouldn't tell anybody. I would call the dispatcher on their private phone and say, you know, put them on the detail. So if anybody looked on the dispatch board, it would just look like they were busy doing a report or something like that. But I would have people cover that post, and everyone bonded together as a team to take care of people. Same thing, you know, if I knew, God forbid, we had, you know, an unresponsive baby, and I knew that this officer has 3 kids that are 2, 4, and 6, I'm going to ask the other, and I'm going to ask, hey, the only reason I'm asking you, I know it's his call, but you're a single guy, 30 years, you know what I mean? Like, that's going to be difficult for him because his daughter, you know, that type of thing.
Right.
And people appreciated that, and I was always there for those things. As much, I wasn't doing it because I was a glutton for punishment, because I had my own young kids as well. But I'm a leader, you know, and I'm not going to duck out of that. And I wanted them to know I'm not going to ask you to do something that I'm not going to be there too. And you know, people dismiss how it can impact you when you know, when to see something like that, you know, to have young kids. I remember my son had just been born, and there was a 2-year-old boy that had drowned in a bathtub, and I got called in for my first fatal accident. The medical examiner needed me to fill them in with a bunch of information, and on the next table over, they're doing the autopsy for this 2-year-old. And if you've ever seen an autopsy, it's incredibly graphic, and even for someone that is, you know, hardened. And at one point, as the coroner is manipulating his body around, his head falls, and when I tell you he was staring right at me, it was, you know, he's got his head peeled forward. It was the most surreal, wild, like out of a movie. And it chilled me to the bone. And I remember months later, my wife saying to me, you know, recognizing that I was being weird with my son. He was only a few days old at the time that happened. And because I had left the hospital to come and deal with that. And I went back, and I didn't realize it was just, I was so affected by that, you know, that I was, I guess, subliminally trying to, you know, put a little emotional distance just in case something weird happened. But, you know, being in that moment, and then, you know, I remember being at a football game years later and hearing someone scream, and I'm sure everyone who's been on the job, you know, you have a smell, a sound, a song, something that reminds you of a thing. And, you know, I remember being at a house fire, totally fully, I mean, this thing was raging, and a girl showed up, and she's screaming. That's my grandmother in there. Clearly she was not gonna, that was not a survivable fire. And I remember to this day that the sound of her screams and the strength that she had as I'm trying to hold her back. And she's not a bad guy, so I'm trying to be as gentle as I can, but she's got just superhuman strength, and she can't run into the house on fire, you know, because she's going to get hurt. And it was, so all these weird little things, that's the stuff that is like Chinese water torture, I think, that if you don't learn how to deal with it, it can add up. And it's, you just carry this weight and hold it and hold it and hold it over years. Yeah, it really does. And so something really small can happen, and then somebody will just snap, and they don't realize it wasn't that thing. That thing was just the final straw on the camel's back, you know, over years of either just self-neglect or, you know, not wanting to deal, or not knowing how to deal with these things. And I'm not even going to go down the rabbit hole of, you know, some agencies that you ask for help, they sideline you, they take your gun, they, you know, all this other stuff. That's a whole different conversation.
They make it punitive, yeah.
It doesn't help, put it that way. And, you know, but to use my story, if you're an agency that's forcing people back to work because they're physically okay, but their doctor's telling them that they need a little more time to process everything, let them do it, you know. And especially in my particular case, like you said, I would have worked for free. There were nights that if you told me, like, we need an extra guy, you know, I would have been at work because I loved it so much. I didn't care. And so to be that go-getter and to always be there and always be running into trouble and, you know, never call out sick and always show up first and leave last, and then you kind of get hung out to dry, that's when, if it's not handled right, that's when you can start to sour. on the job, on the department, and that's all of a sudden when you start noticing that's when those 5 to 10 year officers, and then it turns into this place sucks, you know. And you same conversation a couple years ago was how excited they were gonna go do this unit, and you know, and then they were all jazzed about what they were up to, and now all of a sudden they sound like they've been on the job 40 years. You know, they've been through 3 divorces and they got 9 kids that they're paying for, you know. And it's like, guy, you know, take a break. It's not that bad, you know. But they didn't know any better. So I think, you know, showing them that perspective and giving them that framing really helps. You know, obviously from a department standpoint, having better policies put into place, but not being that supervisor that, I mean, I remember, this is awesome. I remember I'm coming home from the doctor after that incident where I got jumped by those guys, the gangbangers, and I'm coming home. I walk in the door and my wife is on the phone and she's screaming and swearing, F you, and she goes, "Here, it's for you." And I'm like, who the heck could be like that? Who is that? She's like, "It's the chief." And she handed me, and I'm like, "Yeah, right." She handed me the phone. It was the chief. And you know what she said was that he was more concerned about all these other things that were going on. I think it had taken him like a couple days, like, or a week or something wild before he even called to see how I was doing. And she was like, "What do you care?" You know, she just let him have it because she didn't know any better. That's my wife. But she had every reason to say that, you know, and I saw that in multiple incidents. I remember one later on with a different chief where there was an officer involved shooting, and the officer who does the shooting got hurt, bad guy, and they're in the same hospital, and the chief goes and spends time with the bad guy first. Like, it was just bad form. It was bad form, you know.
Say at least, yeah.
You know, so when people put themselves, they put their lives on the line, they put their careers on the line, they want at least a sense that it's not for nothing. You know, they're not just doing it for the personal satisfaction. And I used to say that to people, you know, if you've been on the job for 30 years and something weird happens at the end of your career, yeah, it does count. It should absolutely count that you have been coming to work for 30 years, 100%. Now, that doesn't mean you get a free pass on anything, but it means you should at least get some consideration, because a 30-year veteran that's been through the ringer and finds themselves, you know, in the jackpot is different than somebody that is 2 years on and they're just screwing up purposely all the time and never really being called to task. And that, again, that's a whole other situation, a conversation about A-team and, you know, fairness in the way things are doled out. But all those things are real. And even when they don't happen to people, you know, it still has an effect, although it has a much more of an effect, because I can't tell you how many times that I would be, you know, involved with something with one of the bosses over nonsense, you know, and guys are like, you know, what are you complaining about? And then all of a sudden, the first time that they find themselves in a situation that's unfair, and now they're whining and complaining to everybody, and no one wants to hear it, and they look at me, and I'm like, it's different now, right? Yeah. It's different because now you know what it feels like. You know what it's like to get screwed, or you know what it's like to get passed over for something that you rightfully deserved, that because you didn't know the right person, or you didn't have the right last name, or whatever the case might be, you know, that affects you. That affects you for sure. Now, on a department of our size, it wasn't that bad because there were always opportunities, as you mentioned a few minutes ago, there were always opportunities to get away from, either get closer to a good thing or get further away from a bad thing. But again, most agencies are not that big. You know, most agencies are in that 20 to 60, 80 range. And if you're in a department, I remember meeting a guy on one job, his supervisor was sleeping with his wife. So the police officer, his wife was cheating on him with his sergeant. And the guy found out about it. And I mean, beside what I was shocked at how it didn't go the way I thought it would, he goes, "I come to work every night and look at this guy." Like, how is that? Like,
they'll punch him in the face.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, you know, again, even down to the tactical side, you know, as I taught, there were some communities that were really, really small, very, very rural, and would not really have any calls. I mean, there were guys that were saying that they would go an entire week with not one call. No, not one. I mean, that never happened on our job. We wouldn't go an hour without a call. So to go a week with nothing, I mean, just making sure the battery didn't die, was wild. But I said, you know, so as much as we're in we're in physical, and violent situations much more frequently, helps right there. When you're the only officer working in a rural community and you know that your backup is 20 minutes away, assuming that they know where you are and that they can find you, because don't forget, this is pre-Garmin, we didn't have cell phones. You literally had to pull out a map and look at the map, right? I don't know, you're probably too young for this too, Mike. You'd have to pull a street and it would give you grid coordinates, right? It would say A4, and then you'd have to look in this big square of A4, and where is that street? And then, okay, now I got to figure out how to get, we didn't have to just punch in the address and go, and it tells you turn right here, all that. It wasn't like that. So as much as I used to say to those guys, I'm not going to come here and look down on you and talk down on you guys. Oh, I'm a big city guy, and you guys don't know what it's like. I'm telling you that you need to be more careful than us, because there's always plenty of help around us. So even if you're not that good, you're okay. But if you're the guy that's out there with a car with 4 gangbangers on the side of the road in the middle of the night and they know you're alone, you better be able to do what you got to do, because that might be a real long night for you, So every job has its challenges. They're all the same. They just change in magnification, I guess you can say, depending on the environment you're in. But we all face the same stuff. I think that's why it's really it's great that I see that there are a lot of agencies that are coming out of the dark ages that are getting more forward thinking with officer wellness and how they deal with all these different types of things. But it's also scary to realize that there are still so many more that aren't. And obviously, I'm hoping that will change, and hopefully quickly. I noticed that there seems to be, I don't know if it's cyclical or if it's because of the political cycle, but it seems like there's a changing of the guard with chiefs across the country. A lot of my friends that are chiefs are retiring now. New chiefs are coming on board, sheriffs all across the country. So I'm hoping that will bring even more young blood and more new ideas to some of these places that maybe need to get a little more forward thinking. But at the same time, all that to say, Mike, we're all doing the same job. We're all facing the same stuff, just in different degrees and on different days. You know what I mean?
Right. But it all adds up at the end of the day. And I think this conversation that we had tonight perfectly highlights that. Time for the rapid fire. But first, a word, of course, is the rapid fire tonight is brought to you by our friends over at Granite State Health. Hey there, firefighters and fire buffs. If you're tuning into the Mike to New Haven podcast, you know the value of reliable gear. At Granite State Fire Helmets, we're proud to introduce the TL2, our premium leather Phoenix fire helmet. The TL2 is all about comfort, durability, and that timeless style you trust. And here's the best part. All in-stock inventory usually ships within 24 hours, so you'll have it in your hands in no time. Plus, our company is proudly owned and operated by firemen, so you know we've got your back and understand exactly what you need out there on the front lines. So don't wait. Gear up with the TL2 today. Granite State Fire Helmets, where tradition meets innovation, and where firemen have you covered. A lot of ground covered, and we'll cover some more with the rapid fire, of course, as aforementioned, brought to you by our friends over at Granite State. First question, a lesson from the Marine Corps you still use today, just in life in general.
That's an easy one. That's AIO. I even named my business after it. That one actually came from an event while I was in boot camp. There is something called a fartlet course, which I wasn't too good with. I think it's Swedish at the time, but translated from Swedish means holy hell on earth. No, I forget what it means, but it's basically you run, you sprint, you get to a station, you do like push-ups, you run, you sprint. Well, the part that I didn't know about is that means that the run doesn't necessarily have an end. So that particular time, I was the guide for our battalion. Basically, I was up at the front with our commanding officer, and it looks cool on a poster, but you have to run with this little flag called a guidon, and that's the name of it if you've seen it with any military unit. And it looks cool, but you might as well be dragging a tire on the ground behind you because you can't use your hands and you're just stuck there, and of course it's that moment. So it just so happened that one particular day I was feeling we were going really fast, and I looked over at my commanding officer as we get to the finish line, where we normally stop, and I could have sworn I saw a little smirk in the corner of his mouth, and he kept going. And I remembered every bell and whistle in my brain going off because I had used every bit of what I had left to get to that point, and now we didn't know where we were going to end. So I have knives in my stomach, knives in my lungs, my legs are killing me. I feel like I'm gonna pass out. And at that time, there were really only two options for me. One is what they call falling out. You just stuck to the side, and for me, it was way different because now I'm at the front of this huge line of 100 Marines, and now I got to hand it to somebody else. So it's very emasculating. It's very embarrassing. So that's not even really an option, right? And the other one is to pass out. And as silly as it might sound now, at that time, I legitimately believed I was going to die. And I remember thinking, you know what? And this is all happening in like a half a second. And I remember thinking to myself, I'm not doing it. There's no way. Like, I'll die with this thing. I can pry it out of my cold dead hands. And like, it seemed like only a few seconds later, we finally stopped running. But in that moment, what that did for me is, it happened in multiple situations for me psychologically, but in this particular case, it was more physical, that it taught me that I had a level that I never knew I had. Like David Goggins calls it the cookie jar. Everybody has their own expression. I think Jocko Willink's got a similar one, but everybody has one. And that's the point is, and I talk a lot about that in what I teach, is ego is not bad in and of itself. Excessive ego is bad, but ego is important. Ego does things like in that particular moment, that's what kept me going. In that moment, I thought of all the teachers, you come up with little tricks in your own mind to get through certain situations. And sometimes it would be I'm running to a helicopter to save my family. In this particular case, it was everyone that had ever told me I was never going to be anything. And now I'm like proving them right. Like, I don't care. And, and getting through that moment, it gave me a level of physical and mental confidence that I had never had before. And I kind of leveled it up from there. And it's hard to describe. It's almost like, if you've been through something really wild, hard, and you're trying to tell someone else what it's like when people talk about the Marine Corps. That's why the Marine Corps is the way it is. So if I'm in Japan and I see someone and they're wearing a Marine Corps t-shirt and I'm wearing a Marine Corps t-shirt, we're going to wave at each other and it's going to be, what's up? I don't know that guy, he don't know me. It's because we've been through the same challenge. We've been exposed to the same culture and we get it. And, you see it with Harley riders. It's that whole thing if you're in that group, because if you don't do what they're doing or you haven't been through what they've been through, then you don't get it. I can't describe, no one can tell me what it's like to give birth and be a mother. I can watch videos, I can hear about it, but until I've done it. And same thing with this. So what it allowed me to do years later as a mentor was show others that were going through things of how to use those experiences in a productive way to make them quote unquote harder. Or more adaptable, what I like to say, more adaptable.
Absolutely.
And because it's absolutely a skill and it absolutely can be learned. And I'm living proof of it. And I grew up a buck-toothed kid that nobody liked, and I wound up in a pretty good place. A lot of it through hard experiences, but also through converting those hard experiences into a positive thing. And I think that's the difference is either you're going to, because the way I would say it plainly is, what are you going to do about it? Something bad happened. Are you going to learn and get better? Or are you just going to sit on the ground and have a victim mentality and say, oh, woe is me? That doesn't serve you. So learn from this, get a new skill, take something out of it, learn how not to do it. And I'll tell you what, people ask me all the time from a leadership standpoint, I absolutely learned more by watching people do it wrong. Because when
that's
you're
true.
Right? When you see something go sideways or when you're mistreated or treated unfairly, you never forget how that feels. And I can't tell you how many times throughout my career I said to myself, I will never talk to someone like that, or I will never make someone feel the way that person just spoke to me or made me feel. And those are really powerful lessons because they sometimes knowing what not to do is better than knowing what to do, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, and that's the thing. You have a template now to go off of, or I saw how that went wrong. Now you know what to avoid and why, because you saw it. I remember there was a great fighter in MMA, early 2000s MMA, Carroll, very good grappler, good submission artist. He had a great record for his career. He won a lot of fights, but he said, I learned more from the fights, and he didn't have many losses. I think he only lost like 7 or 8 fights. He won like 30 something. But he said, I learned more from the fights I had that I lost than the ones that I won. And that's the reason why you have a template. Now you know what not to do. So I think that's very well said. Toughest second question, toughest moment on the job between either being a supervisor or just being on the street as a patrol officer that you had in Providence.
Toughest moment on the job. Well, I would have a couple for different reasons. You know, burying my cousin, that was a tough one.
Sorry.
That's the Sergeant Malloy that I talked about. They can't prove it, but pretty sure he had a very rare form of cancer, very young, probably from 9/11. He was there helping after the 9/11 attacks. So, you know, but that was for multiple reasons, and not the least of which is, you know, anytime you're at a cop funeral, and good luck getting cops to those, you know, when they're not. It's because it reminds you that you know that you're human, that you're someday you're going to be back in the ground too, you know, and no one wants to acknowledge that. You know, but that's more of on a personal note. On a professional note, I mean, I can't count the number of incidents, you know, of people getting hurt and different things. But I would have to say the ones that were the toughest for me were when I was in a leadership position and something bad was happening to one of my guys or girls, and there was nothing I could do about it. And that was what really, that was what, when you asked me earlier about, you know, burnout, I guess you could call it that, but being in a position that you should be able to help fix things and you still can't, that helpless feeling is very difficult, especially for people that do what we do. Is hard to manage and you know and keep it under control in a way that doesn't get you in trouble, or where you're going to speak out or do something that you shouldn't do just out of emotion. But yeah, I could bore you with hundreds of them for all the wrong reasons. But I would just say that bad leadership was at the root of all of them.
As is the case with a lot of things, unfortunately. On a more uplifting note, switching the subject matter, well, keeping the subject matter the same, but switching the question, most rewarding experience that you had as a shift commander?
Oh, man. There were so many. I mean, I've told a bunch of them already, because what I learned, too, as I got further on in my career was, you know, and I talk about this a lot with senior law enforcement executives now, is and I use the Viking story. So Viking lore holds that you die 2 deaths, right? I'm sure you've heard this before. The first one when your body passes away, and the second death that you die is the last time someone mentions your name. So what I try to impress upon senior leadership in law enforcement now is it's no longer about you. It's no longer about what you're going to accomplish or what you've already done all that. You know, obviously to get here, you've accumulated all these accolades, awards, whatever. Now it's about building your legacy. And the reason why I told that story about the Viking thing is because even now, you know, years later being gone, obviously I'm still in touch with a lot of guys that are there, and new officers will hear about this Lieutenant Carroll, you know, and all the different, some good, some bad, you know, things that I was involved in, but your reputation is still there, and it's used as a tool to help others learn and get better. And I think once people start to understand that really is powerful, and it's so much more rewarding than you just putting another challenge coin on your deck or another plaque on the wall or whatever, you know, to see someone else succeed because of the way that you help them is incredibly, it's intoxicating at times. I mean, it's so wild because it's the same thing you go through as a parent, you know, like when you teach your kids how to do something, but it's the first time that you let them do it for themselves, and then you see the excitement in their face, like, wow, it worked, I did it all by myself. Same thing there. And to me, you know, like we talked about earlier, to be that super crazy, aggressive cop, and then to have to learn to adjust and to be the one in the background, where now it's not about me anymore, it's about building my team and making my team better and giving them credit. It takes a lot of adjustment, and the higher you go, the harder it can be for some people, because ego becomes part of who you are, right? You become known as the chief or the sheriff or the whomever, and for some people it's hard to, what are you going to do when you're not wearing the uniform anymore and you're bumping into people at the supermarket? and it's either just Sean and Mike, you know. And I think that's what gives you that the gift that keeps on giving, you know, because now to watch, and I still do it now. Some of them don't realize, but I keep tabs on my guys, you know, the ones that I had a hand in helping, and you know, partially selfish that I want to feel good about it, but it's because I want to see them succeed. And I think when you change your mindset to what do I got to do to help me, to now in a general sense, what do I got to do to help my team? What do I have to do? Like if you're a chief and you're a sheriff, you should have a rock star team of sergeants and some really cool lieutenants. And because that's the progression that's going to happen when you're gone. That's who's going to be left. Because if you're an awesome chief and the moment you leave, your department implodes, or because you have a rotten, toxic leadership chain that you haven't paid attention to, and the moment you leave, they take over and now they run it into the ground, what's the point? You know, all that for what? You know, and now that's how you're known is, oh, you're the chief of that department, where all this bad stuff is happening. You know, so I think it's giving people that mindset of understanding that it, again, shifting it from taking all those lessons that you have and sharing them so that others can learn. And I tell that story in the class that I teach. Is a movie I saw years ago. It was a woman who had lost her family, and she was basically suicidal, and she's just trying to find meaning in life. And she decides to walk the Appalachian Trail. It's about 1,800 miles from Maine down to Georgia. And every, 100 miles or so, there's a little podium with a book in it, and a little covering, and you know, you can write a date or an inscription or a quote or something inspiring or whatever. And that's kind of how I see my career, and what I'm doing is I'm writing in that book. I'm, like I used to say, I'm not better than you. I'm not smarter than you. I'm just further along on the path. So I'm going to give you tips and tricks that I didn't know so that you don't have to make the same mistakes and learn the hard way like I did. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And well, you kind of answered the fourth question rapid fire. I was going to talk about leadership mistakes that really taught you the most. You covered it well. So we'll skip that because you answered both the third and the fourth one with the previous answer. Last question is in line with that. Advice the next generation of police leaders. Let's say you grab a new sergeant, grab a new lieutenant. You know, what would you tell them?
You know what? As you just said that, Mike, if I may, because there's one incident from a pure like operational leadership standpoint that comes to mind. Back in 2014, I was May of 2014. I had been a sergeant for almost a year at that point. I was working the overnight shift, and I pulled an extra shift, a detail at the circus. So it's the Ringling Brothers Barnum and Bailey Circus, and it's a Sunday morning show. So they used to come in and do circus on Friday, a couple on Saturday, a couple on Sunday. So again, it's a circus. It's kids. It's a Sunday morning. No big deal. I mean, this is as easy as it gets. Now, we had worked the overnight shift, and so we had gone home at like 7 or 8 o'clock, slept for like 2 hours, and got up, came back, and today was one of those days that the 2 hour nap was worse. So I felt worse than when I should have just stayed awake. And the funny part was I was actually walking the concourse of the event center, just literally to stay awake because I was that tired, and I was like, I can't even sit still because I'm gonna fall asleep. So I'm walking around, and at one point there was a guy there with his kids, and he sees the pin on my uniform for the rifle team, and he's making jokes like, oh, if the tiger gets out, you know, you're gonna shoot the tiger, and you know, he's in front of the kids, and I'm like, come on, guy. So you know, the show starts, I'm doing my laps, and all of a sudden I hear this really loud, weird noise. And you know, it's a circus, right? So you don't really think a whole lot of it, but it was enough that I start walking over to where the curtains are, because now I want to peek in and see what's going on. And it just happened to be at the same section as the same guy, and he pops his head out and he looks at me, and his eyes bug out, and he's like, you got to get in here. And I'm like, come on, guy, don't start. Like, he's just having fun with me. And I could tell he wasn't. And he goes, no, you got to get in here. So as I walk in, I look, and I don't even really know what I'm looking at. I see this gigantic octagon that it's a metal frame in the shape of a stop sign that's like 30 feet across. And there's all these people. It looks like Gettysburg. There's just bodies all over the floor. I have no idea what's going on. And so there's music playing, And it takes me a couple minutes as I'm walking down to the floor that I don't even know what's happening because no one's really reacting. So what I found out later is what had happened was they had an act, a hair hanging act called the human chandelier. And there were 8 women attached by their hair, like a braid, to a corner of this thing. And they had done this whole show, right? And so what happens is the device, what's holding the entire apparatus, snaps, and they fall from the ceiling. It was probably 30 feet onto concrete below. Well, and there was a 9th person underneath them that was part of the act that was moving around that happened to get hit as they're falling on top of them. So I don't know any of this. And to the circus's credit, they had a policy that if something out of the ordinary like that happened, that they would lower these privacy screens, for lack of a better term. They had designs on them, and they would lower the lights a little bit and play this music as a way of kind of distracting everybody from, what was happening, which really worked out well because it avoided the instant reaction. Because even if you ever watch some of the YouTube videos, that there were a bunch of people that recorded on their phones, that you can hear them like say, is that part of the act? Like, is that supposed to happen? And it was only because of the way that they responded immediately, which was great. But as I get down to the floor, here comes the fun part. So now I get down to the floor, and there's 9 people. They're severely injured, the bones sticking out, all kinds of stuff. I'm thinking some might be dead or soon to be. And I reach up, and in one of those moments where my heart just fell, as I hit the button and boop, no signal. I'm in the bottom floor of this concrete event center. It's a 15,000 seat event center, and I can't get out. Like I can't get anything. So I pull out my phone, and no signal. I'm like, you got to be kidding me. So now I see everybody's getting up. It's thousands of people. They're not running, but they're walking, some quicker than others, to the exit. So now I'm like, oh my God, I got to get my officers. There's 2 officers that are with me that are supposed to handle traffic, pedestrian traffic outside. Well, the way that particular assignment worked was they only work for them is at the beginning and at the end. So in the middle, it was like, if they wanted to go get a coffee, go eat, whatever, they didn't have anything to do. It was their only job was to man the crosswalks at the beginning and at the end. So I can't get a hold of them. So now I'm like, you got to be kidding me. So I see one of the doors that go outside. So I walk over quickly. Luckily, I get signal. I call them on the phone. I don't get them the first time. I'm able to get them the second time. Hey guys, I don't know what's going on. Something happened, but I need you to get outside. Cool. All right. So that's done. Now at least one thing is done. I run back over. Again, I can't get, and I'm like, God, I go back because I just had a brain fart. Now I can't call for rescues. I need 9 rescues. I'm in a city with 5. So where are 9 going to come from, right? At that time. And talk about the planets aligning. It just so happened that a bunch of rescues had just finished runs at Rhode Island Hospital, which is our level 1 trauma center, which is only a couple miles away. Mm-hmm. And they were from neighboring agencies, and they happened to be finishing their runs, heading back when they heard the mass casualty call come over. So it was just thank God, it was the perfect alignment of the planets that day. And we found out later, it was something incredible. Like, we literally, from the time that I first got in touch with the dispatcher to the last patient leaving, was something like 9 minutes. It was unbelievably low. I've had people shot 2 blocks from the hospital. It takes 20 minutes to get a rescue there. So it worked out great. Everybody survived later, to spoiler alert. But as we're sitting there, all right, cool. So as I'm talking to one of the guys, this other security guard comes running up, panicked, and he goes, "We can't get the rescues in." And I said, "What are you talking about?" He's like, "The thing is blocked." And it's not clicking what he's saying. So there's one driveway from the main road in the front that comes around the arena to the back that leads to the service entrance. And that's a huge roll-up door where you can bring in 18-wheelers and all that type of stuff. The problem is, guess what? It's the circus. So there are elephant pens in the middle of the driveway and tiger cages and all. And I'm like, I had that split-second moment where you're like, is this, like, seriously? Is somebody?
Well, that's a problem.
Like, give me a break. Like, come on, really? So luckily, a quick thinking couple animal trainers, they moved the elephant pens and all this other stuff before the first rescue arrives. So it's like one problem after another. So now the rescues get in, and I'm like, I'm good, right? At this point, my phone's starting to blow up. It's the chief, the mayor, the commander, the phones. Now this is going viral almost immediately. Everybody's hearing about it. And so now I finally get everyone transported. In the middle of all that, by the way, I realized that a bunch of them, English is not their first language. There's like Russian, Portuguese, Spanish. So some of them, I don't know if just because of the trauma or whatever, but they can't even speak. So I'm like, God, now I have to find somebody. Luckily I find someone that has a laptop with all their information, and then I find somebody else that can translate. This is crazy. And I'm just stuffing people in rescues, like this has never been done before. We finally get everybody going, and it's done, right? Mm-hmm. So I go over to where everything is still laying on the ground, and I'm looking at it, and I see this carabiner, and it's that thing that you put, keys on, that you clip on your belt, right? And I look at it, and I'm saying to myself, okay, the first thing they teach you in the academy, right, is treat everything as a crime scene. You never know what it is. So I just walk over to one of the people that was with the act, because you could tell by their outfit, and I said, hey, I gotta ask, any reason? And he goes, yeah, I couldn't believe the guy who welded the whole thing just was screaming at his wife right before the thing, and all this craziness, and they're having all kinds of argument. And I'm like, you gotta be kidding me. So now I'm like, then I go over and I look, and it was the carabiner had snapped. Well, did it snap or was it cut? So I'm like, you gotta be kidding. So now I have to call OSHA. I'm on the phone, and I'm like almost delirious because I'm so just sleep deprived. And I'm on the phone with the guy from OSHA. He was somewhere halfway from Boston to Maine. He was like, yeah, I'll be there in hours. I'm like, you gotta be kidding me. I'm holding my eyelids open with tape at this point. And on top of all that, now we got a crime scene. I'm like, does that mean I have how many thousand eyewitnesses that I need to go get now? Is this entire arena a crime scene? Like, what just happened? And we were able to get through it. They found out later that it was defective equipment, unfortunately. But luckily everybody survived. But without a doubt, that was one of my toughest from an operational standpoint. And the reason why I say that was not that it was the toughest. It was the toughest because it was like a cascade of failures. Like every time I thought I was good, and you go, oh man, like this crazy challenge, and awesome, like, and you'd feel like I stuck the landing, I made it, I'm good, and then here comes another wave. Nope, you're not done yet. So for me, again, being sleep deprived, and I don't think people really appreciate what that does. And if you want to go on YouTube and YouTube search for sleep deprivation, and they'll show you those videos of when they keep people awake for like 24 hours and they're trying to do math equations, and they can't drive, they can't do math, and never mind making split-second life and death decisions. And that's what a lot of people on both sides fire as well. They do the same thing. They're working these crazy shifts, crazy hours. You go to a huge fire, you might only get a little bit of a break, and then something else happens immediately thereafter. So, for all those of you out there that you wonder why your dad or husband or wife or mom, that's a firefighter or paramedic or a police officer, and they come in and they say, just give me a minute, that's what they're talking about, right? My kids just knew. I had a little room where I had a closet where I put all my stuff, and that was kind of like my decompression chamber of, take a few minutes, kind of get your head in the right place to be with the family, because it didn't take me long to figure out, I also don't want to be telling gory stories about, the last shooting I went to in front of my 5-year-old kids, because then of course they don't understand and they get scared. So, of course Dad is invincible. He's going to live forever. Don't you worry. I got it all figured out.
And nothing says on the fire side. Some of my friends have lived it. Thank you, have a day. Then after a second alarm fire, here's a chest pain call, by the way. Can you go to that once you clear up deconning? And again, it's the same thing in police. You just finished up going to a shooting, a stabbing, a really, really violent domestic, and all of a sudden here's a parking complaint. So it's just, you're going from 0 to 100 back down to 0 all the time. And I say it before and I say it again. People kind of, because where I work, dispatch runs out of the police department. Some of the officers there, the chief there, says, you sure you don't want to be a cop? I'm like, and I said, Chief, respectfully, I could never do your job. He's like, you'd rather run into a burning building? I'm like, yes, at least I know what I'm getting into.
Yeah.
I couldn't pull
we say the same thing. No, I would never want to do that. And I'm like, I'm not touching that stuff. And oh my God, what do you guys do? You do that? No. At least the bad guy, I have a fighting chance. Fire is a totally different beast.
Yeah, well, listen, but again, thank you for this conversation. Thank you for all you've done and continue to do. This has been a lot of fun, and you're definitely welcome back anytime. Before I say goodbye to the audience, if you have any shout outs to anyone or anything, LT, by all means, fire away. Floor is yours.
I just want to say thank you to you, Mike. This has been a great experience. I love your show. It's an honor and a privilege to be in the same place where so many legendary guys that are so much better than me have been before me. So I'm humbled to be here. For those that follow me on LinkedIn, obviously I have AIO Leadership now. I just wrote the book. Matter of fact, AIO Leadership for Law Enforcement. So anybody out there, it's on Amazon. And I also have an online course, the Sergeant's Crucible, and I have a Commander's Crucible. And I will be teaching an online version coming up August 3rd to 6th in Massillon, Ohio. It's all on the website. I took a very comprehensive 4-day course that I had been, 3-day course that I've been teaching with the FBI NAA, and I just built on it and made it brand new. So it's literally brand new, and it's just coming out next month in the next few days, and super excited about that. And we'll be taking the show on the road and hopefully telling more of these stories and most importantly, impacting the next generation of leaders, because that's really what it's all about. And for those of you out there listening that are leaders, remember my line: people don't leave bad agencies, they leave bad bosses. So be the boss you want to work for. Thank you.
There you go. Well said. Thank you. Stick around. We'll talk off there. Again, thanks to everybody who tuned in tonight. This was a lot of fun. And again, I appreciate all you coming by week after week to continue to tune in to the program. Coming up next on the Mike the New Haven podcast, I had to reschedule with him because we had some scheduling conflicts going on. Nick Palumbo's got a podcast of his own. He's a firefighter on the federal side of New Jersey, a lot of extensive experience. Recently wrote a book of his own, and he'll be coming on to talk about that for what'll be our other nationwide series, which is The Best, the Bravest Nationwide, featuring him. So very much look forward to us getting to finally get a chance to link up and collaborate. That's next Wednesday, June 3rd. 6 p.m., after which I'll be busy watching Game 1 of the NBA Finals, so that may or may not be a quicker show than most, but we will definitely bring it to you live and in living color next Wednesday, 6 p.m.
Mike, excuse me, Mike, if I may, I'd be remiss if I did not have a shout out for my very good friend, Sergeant Miguel Riccio, if he's still hanging in there with us. Rock star, amazing guy, great cop, incredible friend, super proud to call him a friend, an amazing guy who's been through stuff that none of us would ever survive, and he just does it like it's easy. So thoughts and prayers with him, and appreciate if he's still there hanging in there. He's an amazing guy. I look forward to getting together with him real soon.
Shout out to him, and thank you, sir, for all that you've done, Sergeant Riccio. For those of you listening on the audio side, from their landmark 1986 album, Please, a personal favorite of mine, the Pet Shop Boys with their 1984 classic came out on the album later, West End Girls. In the meantime, on behalf of Lieutenant Sean Carroll and producer Victor, I am Mike Colón. This has been volume 25 of the Beat, Profiles of Police Nationwide, and we will see you next time. Take care of yourselves, everybody. Take care of each other. And yes, during this special time, go Knicks, and good night.